Chapter 10:57. A few days later, everything was calm and peaceful. In the morning, at the north gate of the town, Tang casually sat on a green stone by the side of the road. With one hand on his knee and his chin on his hand, he frowned slightly. The slight cold wind blew his fringe in front of his forehead. He was motionless, like a stone statue in the town square at this time. Although his eyes were looking into the distance, his eyes were obviously not focused. He was in a daze, as if he was thinking, from initial investigation to the arrival of the brand construction team, and now waiting for the official arrival of Josiah and the brand negotiation team. Tang led the gray space and stayed in this town for a whole week. He also checked for a week, but until now, the bad premonition in his heart was still there, but he still did not find any problems. There was no sign of danger at all. His expression did not change, but his heart was unusually irritated. He dared not to investigate, and he used all the means that should not be used. Tang thought that he had done the best in the security matters. It was not an exaggeration to say that he had stepped on every inch of the strictly controlled town behind him. He had checked every building. He was just short of digging 3 feet into the ground. But in the end, he still did not find anything, not only in the town, but also in the surrounding 30 miles of the town. He had carried out a carpet search. Not to mention that there might be Blank's army hiding in the town. Even the low-level demonic beasts with some damage ability were wiped out completely. Don't think that the scenery here was still calm and peaceful. In fact, in the surrounding hills, the elite cavalry of the Gray Coat Army had already drawn their bows and swords out of their sheaths. Once there was any abnormal situation, they could quickly rush to the town in a moment and surround it. Or they could meet the enemy and ensure the safe evacuation of the people in the town. In this way, the possible surprise attack from the outside of the town was ruled out. Inside and outside the town, he had considered all possible means of attack, sources of danger, and so on. But why did his intuition of danger not stop? Well, sometimes even Tang felt that he was overthinking, and having an obsessive-compulsive disorder. Otherwise, how could he explain the current situation? Boss! In the distance, with a loud shout, David strode over. Without turning his head, Tang calmly said, "The brand negotiation team has arrived?" "Yes, from a south gate." That extravagance. TSK, as expected of the second prince of the empire. Looking at those purebred white horses pulling the carriage, their value is comparable to dozens of purple bore cannons. Smacking his lips, David could not help but shake his head in admiration. His expression and body movements were all illustrating the true meaning of the word loser. Then, he casually sat beside Tang and narrowed his eyes as he looked into the distance. "Leader, are they not here yet?" "Of course, the winner has to appear in the finale. It's almost time. Just a quarter of an hour more." Tangen's posture did not change as he casually replied. Seeing this, David scratched his head. "Boss, do you still think there's a problem here?" The gray space naturally trusted and was loyal to Tang. This week, because of Tang's intuition, David and the others did not sleep for several days and nights. He shook his head. "I don't know, but there's an 80% to 90% chance that Bran is up to something." Why do you say that?" Tang pondered for a moment and said, "Do you still remember when Josiah refused to accept the conferment of the red-cloaked Archbishop of the Temple, and there was a stalemate with Bran's side? What was the result? A week later, Bran's side simply agreed with Josiah's opinion. There's something wrong with the change in attitude. There must be something wrong if there's an abnormality. And 1 week is enough to set up too many schemes. Then what should we do now? The negotiation is about to begin." Tangen's guess was just a guess. There was no actual evidence to support it. However, although they had been investigating for a whole week, David and the others did not waver in their judgment of Tang. Hearing this, they directly said, "Why don't we change the venue temporarily? Anyway, it's just an agreement. I don't think Bran's side will dare to have any objections." "It's too late." Tang waved his hand lightly and pointed behind him. "It's not like you didn't see the grand venue in the town center. If we change the venue temporarily, I'm afraid Bran's side will have something to say. Of course, we don't care about the gossip, But this is related to the reputation that the Gray Coat Army has painstakingly built. We can't lose it. F***CKU. David angrily hammered his palms and was depressed. This was the reason. If the Gray Coat Army was still in the initial stage of building up a team, then it was fine if their reputation was ruined. They could still make up for it in the future. Or if the Gray Coat Army had developed to become as powerful as the Bran Empire, then their reputation would not be damaged. There was no need to worry too much about it. But now, the Gray Coat Army was in a new stage after some achievements. They could not afford the slightest turmoil and could not bear the impact of a bad reputation. So even if they knew that there was a hole in front of them, they could only grit their teeth and step through it. After a moment of silence, Tangan took a deep breath and stood up. All right, let's not talk about this for now. Josiah and the others are coming. Go and remind Harry, Luke, and the others to control the venue. Everything must be done according to our plan. Don't be careless. Don't worry, boss. David nodded heavily and turned to leave quickly. At that moment, Tang narrowed his eyes and raised his head. Looking at the messenger who was rushing back in the distance, the corners of his mouth suddenly curled up. Interesting. I like to see what tricks you can play this time. He shook his head. There was no point in thinking too much now. Tang quickly adjusted his mental state and returned to his relaxed state. He walked over to the messenger who was running over. The messenger was a signal, which meant that Josiah and the others had arrived at the periphery of the town. Sure enough, a moment later, smoke and dust rose in the distance. Then, the faint sound of horse hooves drifted over with the wind. A cavalry team of more than 100 people rushed toward the north gate of the town. The rider in the lead was dressed in a pure white cloak. Who else could it be other than Josiah? On the side were familiar faces. Fry, Fei Rue, and a group of old senior members of the Gray Coat Army surrounded Josiah like stars surrounding the moon. Their whips were flying, and the sound of hooves was rapid. It was a majestic sight. With a rough glance, all the senior members of the Gray Coat Army were here. After all, it was such an important moment with far-reaching significance. As long as they could come, naturally, no one was willing to miss it. Seeing this, Tang suddenly had a strange thought. If something really went wrong later, the upper echelons of the Gray Coat Army would be wiped out. He shook his head and threw away this ridiculous black humor. Tang strode forward and looked at Josiah and the others who came closer and tightened their reins to slow down their momentum. They were all overjoyed and overjoyed. He went forward to help Josiah down and chuckled. Haha, you're very happy. It seems that you've gained a lot in this negotiation. Of course, I've gained all that I could. Lifting his chin slightly, Josiah replied proudly. But the next moment, he couldn't hold it in anymore. He chuckled and sighed. Since I joined the Gray Coat Army, I've negotiated with the Bran 3 times. This was the easiest time. We even felt justified in robbing him. Haha, we're the victors after all. Haha, that's right. It's this feeling of robbery. Fry threw away the reins and laughed. At first, we opened up the negotiation conditions that were exorbitant. We even wanted to wait for the other party to bargain before we threw out the real price. We didn't expect that other than a few conditions, the other party would easily agree without much effort. It made us regret it for a while. Ha! There's nothing to say. One word, awesome. Haha. Then let's go to the town to rest and sign the agreement. Tang also smiled and greeted everyone. He shrugged and said, since we're going to get the benefits, we have to give the other party some face. After all, the spendthrifts are the biggest. Haha, that makes sense. The spendthrifts are the biggest, haha. It was obvious that everyone was in a good mood. Of course, this was inevitable. It wasn't as simple as robbing during the negotiation. Most importantly, it was the unparalleled sense of accomplishment that couldn't be suppressed. The Bran Empire, the Gray Coat Army. Although many comparisons have been made, it had to be said that the two really couldn't be compared. The former was like a towering mountain range, and the latter was like a tiny ant crawling on this towering mountain range. But now the tiny ant actually kicked over the towering mountain range with its slender legs. This was a great achievement that made one's body tremble and scalp tingle. When he led everyone into the town while talking and laughing, Tang In quietly pulled Josiah aside and said in a low voice, "Remember, no matter what happens later, don't be more than 3 feet away from me." Josiah was stunned when he heard this. However, he quickly returned to normal. He just restrained his smile and said in a low voice, "Is there a problem?" "There might be a problem. Don't worry, I'll always be by your side." "Okay." Josiah nodded lightly and didn't say anything else. He just squeezed Tang In's palm slightly and then let go. Tang In returned a reassuring smile. Then he took a few steps and approached Fry, the commander of the army, and Fei Rue, the logistics supervisor of the army. He also whispered a few words. Everything was done inadvertently, and no one was alarmed. Even the high-ranking generals of the Gray Coat Army, who were close at hand, didn't notice this detail at all in their excitement. This was the so-called difference between closeness and estrangement. Tang In didn't have any conflicts with these high-ranking generals. When they met, they chatted happily and had a good relationship. However, if one really want to count, then naturally Josiah, Fry, and Fei Rue were the 3 closest. Therefore, to put it bluntly, if something were to happen at the venue later, Tang In would only save these 3 people at the first instance. As for the rest, sorry, he could only wait and see if there was a suitable time to make a move at this moment. Just as Josiah and the others stepped into the north gate of Maple Town, a slightly plump figure holding a long spear stepped out of the remote teleportation tower in a large city more than 100 kilometers away. He looked up at the gloomy sun hanging diagonally in the sky, narrowed his eyes, and pursed his lips. "We've finally arrived." After a slight pause, he waved his hand and ordered the dozens of knights behind him with solemn faces, "Confirm the location of the temporary small teleportation portal and find horses. Next, we have to rush at full speed." "Ride horses?" "But sir, your body—" He waved his hand. "It's fine, I know what I'm doing. I want to ask." His words suddenly paused, and his slightly plump figure trembled slightly. He subconsciously lowered his hand and stroked his lower abdomen. The corners of his mouth curled up slightly. "You can't wait anymore, can you?" "Huh. All right, then let's go save that bastard together." Chapter 1058. Open air, red carpet, colorful flower petals, green turf, arch flower railings, luxurious people wearing silver curly hair and exquisite clothes, and white-haired old men in ordinary clothes held wine glasses and stood on both sides of the red carpet. They toasted each other and laughed nonstop. Elegant waiters in standard uniforms became the only people in the venue who could freely communicate with the left and right areas. They carried wine trays and shuttled back and forth. On the side, a large concert group from somewhere played various instruments in their hands, creating a beautiful movement that was very suitable for the current atmosphere. Don't misunderstand. This was not a wedding, nor was it a large aristocratic cocktail party. It was a major negotiation venue that would affect the future of the continent. That's right. It was a negotiation venue where the Gray Coat Army and the brand's negotiation team officially came into contact. You didn't expect this, did you? In fact, not to mention Josiah and the others who had just arrived, even Tang, and who already knew this was going to happen, felt helpless when he saw this scene. Damn it. Can't you be more reserved and have some integrity? Those who didn't know the inside story would think that the Gray Coat Army and the brand had formed an alliance. Who would have thought that this was a cruel place where the winner exploited the loser? There was no joy at all, was there? Well, this was not a problem that Tang In could decide, or rather, it was not a problem that could be decided by the Gray Coat Army. The formal negotiation had ended, and the terms of compensation had been finalized. Needless to say, the Gray Coat Army had a lot of benefits. To a certain extent, this result was not achieved by Josiah and the others through hard negotiations. It was because the brand did not even think of bargaining. As long as there were requests, most of them were readily agreed. In this way, the brand's negotiation team made the request to make this negotiation more formal, more orderly, and more empire-like. Naturally, the Gray Coat Army could not say anything. What else could they do? The other party had already made a big concession in terms of practical benefits. How could they not give them face in such a small matter? And since the venue was so luxurious, The other details, such as the formal signing of the negotiation agreement at noon and so on, were naturally handled according to the rules. Therefore, looking at the sun that was hanging in the east, the negotiation venue had become like this in just a few hours before noon. Yes, it was like a cocktail party. It was indeed very empire-like. Therefore, the high-ranking officers of the Gray Coat Army, who were caught off guard, felt like they were standing in the crater of a volcano. They all looked uncomfortable no matter how they stood. When had they ever seen such a scene? Before joining the Gray Coat Army, their identities were ordinary farmers, coachmen, handymen, and even local ruffians. The most luxurious and lively place that they had ever been to was probably the harvest bonfire party in the farm. If they occasionally went to the streets, they would be able to come back and return. With this kind of background, how could they stay in this place that looked like a large aristocratic banquet and treat it with composure? Stop fooling around. They didn't even know how to hold the crystal goblet. In fact, even Josiah, who was born as a noble, was a little confused when he suddenly stood in the middle of the venue and felt this familiar feeling. They are up to no good. Josiah slightly sipped the blood-red wine in the glass and subconsciously remembered the name of the expensive wine. He shook his head and pursed his lips. They want to see us make a fool of ourselves. In fact, this was exactly the case. Separated by the red carpet, the noble members of the brand's negotiation team glanced at the clumsy scene opposite them. From time to time, the corners of their mouths raised into a self-explanatory smile. They really had the elegant demeanor of a noble. There was no impolite pointing, and there was no mocking laughter. However, the slight smile that never disappeared from the corner of their mouths. It was annoying. Don't worry, don't worry. Tangan had been staying beside Josiah. When he heard the words, he raised his head and drank a mouthful of red wine. Like the high-ranking officers of the Gray Coat Army, he grabbed the crystal goblet from the tray in the hands of the passing attendants. His behavior was vulgar and reckless. The practical benefits have been obtained. Haha, let them regain some sense of superiority over this. Vulgar behavior did not mean that Tangan did not have the ability to be elegant, nor did it mean that he did not understand the noble etiquette. In fact, as long as he wanted to, he was a noble. He could do more elegantly and properly than the group of people opposite him. Even if he crossed the red carpet now and entered the group of nobles on the opposite side, there would not be the slightest disharmony. But was there a need for that? Perhaps you should think of it this way. The reason why we can defeat the Bran Empire is because they spent all their energy on this. Josiah was slightly startled when he heard the words. Then he smiled brightly and raised his wine glass to touch Tangan's wine glass. The tinkling sound was crisp. To the Bran Empire spending all their energy on this. Cheers! That makes sense. The Bran Empire today is no longer the powerful empire that swept the four directions, unified the north and the south, and conquered thousands of miles of territory thousands of years ago. Just as Josiah raised his glass, a slightly emotional, gentle, magnetic voice came from the side. When he turned his head, he saw a handsome young man in a luxurious robe crossing the red carpet and approaching with a smile. The current Bran Empire seems to be rich everywhere, but it is barren everywhere. It seems to be strong and powerful, but it has lost its ambition and is just an empty shell. Pause for a while. Looking at Josiah's slightly stunned expression, perhaps he was aware of his abrupt behavior. He raised his wine glass. Well, in fact, what I want to say is that I agree with your evaluation. So, can we have a drink together? Of course. With a tinkling sound, Tangan raised his crystal wine glass and clinked it with the young man's. He shrugged and said, "As long as you don't blame us for slandering you in private, Your Highness." Tangan's eyesight was very good. With just a glance, he recognized from the complicated patterns embroidered on the luxurious robe of the Bran royal family. Then, he identified the young man's true identity. He was the person in charge of the Bran negotiation team, the second prince of the Empire. Sipping his wine, the second prince smiled and shook his head. How could it be? This is the truth. Otherwise, we wouldn't have fallen into such a difficult situation. Tangan raised his eyebrows and did not answer. However, he had to admit that he didn't have a bad first impression of the second prince, whom Philip had always talked about. At this time, the second prince gave a simple royal salute and smiled. "If I'm not wrong, you must be Mr. Tang Yin, right?" Tang Yin could not help but be slightly surprised. He returned the salute and touched his nose. "Am I so famous? You can recognize me at first sight?" "Haha, of course, Mr. Tang Yin's reputation is not small. Whether it was the fight with the sword god not long ago, you were still able to escape unscathed. Also, you had several grudges with the temple. I often heard about you in the capital. However, the first time I heard your name was because of my good friend Philip." Tang Yin suddenly understood. "Oh, that's definitely not something good. Haha, that's true. He said that you stole the person he fell in love with at first sight." Pause for a while. The second prince turned his head with a smile and looked at Josiah, who was still slightly shocked. He bowed again. "That person is the leader of the Gray Coat Army, Miss Josiah." She hurriedly returned the salute. When Josiah was still a noble girl, the distance between her and the noble second prince was very far. When Josiah joined the Gray Coat Army, the distance between them, well, it was even further. Therefore, when she suddenly saw the real second prince who represented the supreme royal power, she was naturally a little shocked. However, Josiah was Josiah after all. In a short moment, she quickly calmed down and stabilized her emotions. It was just that it was really difficult to continue the conversation now. She could only cover her mouth and chuckle, which was a little awkward. Seeing this, the second prince replied apologetically, "Sorry, it was just a joke. I hope you don't mind." "It's okay, I won't mind." Tang Yin narrowed his long and narrow eyes. "The next time I see that guy, I will directly beat him up." Huh. The second prince was stunned for a moment. Then, he could not help but laugh. "It's time to beat him up. I heard that Mr. Tang Yin once went to the capital and even drank with Philip at home. With such an opportunity, he did not even recommend me to meet you. It's time to punish him. It's not too late to meet him now." "Haha, it's not too late. But if we meet now, my status will be a little awkward." The second prince shook his head and laughed bitterly. He paused and looked at Josiah. "I heard that Miss Josiah was also born in a noble family. Her ancestors were once the frontline officers of the empire. Because of her bravery in battle and meritorious service at the border, she was rewarded with a hereditary baron title." "Well, I don't mean anything else. I just feel that Miss Josiah, as a descendant of a noble family who has meritorious service to the empire, has now become the leader of the forces that resist the empire. Such a huge change. It's really ironic to the empire. Perhaps this is the real reason for the decline of the empire." Looking at the second prince who suddenly came and sighed, Tang Yin and Josiah looked at each other. They both felt that it was ridiculous and were a little confused. However, whether it was this frankness or the fact that he looked up the history of Josiah's little southern baron family in detail, it was enough to show that the second prince had indeed come prepared and paid enough attention to this side. Moreover, his gentle attitude and words made it difficult to dislike him even though he was on the opposing side. "All right, haha, it's my fault for saying this now." Seeing that the atmosphere was a little cold, the second prince quickly restrained his emotions and waved his hand with a smile. "Actually, I'm here to tell Miss Josiah about the general process. Well, the name of this negotiation is to confer a title. So, according to the rules, after signing the agreement, I will confer the title of Marquis of the North to Miss Josiah, which is a noble crown. Miss Josiah will have to kneel on one knee to accept it. Of course, this is just a formality. If Miss Josiah is not willing, we can use other actions to replace it." Pause for a while. He shook his head self-deprecatingly. "This job should be the responsibility of a red-robed archbishop. But now I have no choice but to be the bad guy. It's okay." Josiah suddenly interrupted. His expression was casual and self-righteous. "It's just a formality. Anyway, no matter who does this job, I won't follow the rules." Looking at the stunned second prince, Josiah bowed calmly. "I'm sorry. If I do anything inappropriate during the formality, it's not against your highness. It's just that I have my own principles. Chapter 1059. You have your position, and I have mine. Then, there's nothing to talk about. The second prince's expression was still gentle after his astonishment, but there was still some doubt. He was curious about the so-called persistence that Josiah had mentioned. However, it was naturally inappropriate to ask. Even if he asked, Josiah would not be frank in advance. He wisely changed the topic and talked about the anecdotes of the nobles. Occasionally, he would talk about the secrets of royalty that ordinary people would not know. This greatly satisfied Josiah's curiosity, and the atmosphere was naturally very harmonious. This was the so-called main theme of the nobles' banquets. It had to be said that the interaction between people depended on feelings. For example, the second prince was in front of him, although he was on the opposite side, and his identity was extremely honorable. He did not have any arrogance. On the contrary, his speech and behavior were very gentle and polite. He was very measured, and when he talked, he felt like he was bathing in the spring breeze. They chatted until they bowed and left. The sun was hanging in the sky, but Josiah could not have the slightest bad impression of him. After a pause, he came back to his senses and could not help but laugh and shake his head. He's a very powerful person. I didn't notice it just now. Until now, he has been leading the conversation and creating the atmosphere. That's normal. You're a beautiful woman. Men will always be more active in front of beautiful women. Tang did not participate in the conversation except for the beginning of the conversation about Philip. Hearing this, he withdrew his gaze and smiled casually. Of course, Josiah did not want to express this meaning, but he also knew that Tang was joking. He shrugged and whispered with his wine glass. What were you looking at just now? You seem to be very engrossed. Of course, I was looking at a beautiful woman. Tang did not care and replied. Then, he was startled and turned his head to point at Josiah with a ridiculous face. Aha, so this is why you didn't notice it just now? Your thoughts have gone astray, and you still say that others are powerful. Josiah squinted his eyes, emitting a dangerous aura. He did not answer the question at all. Instead, he said softly and seriously, Am I not a beauty? Well, although it was a little narcissistic, it did not match his temperament. She also knew that Tang was joking again, but Josiah was still a little unhappy because there was already a precedent. She realized that she had to keep a closer eye on him. This question was a dangerous one with a hidden trap. However, who was Tang in? In this life, he relied on his reaction to live happily. Hearing this, he chuckled without thinking and said, Of course you're not a beauty, because using the word beauty to describe you is an insult to you. Puff! The frozen river thawed, and the earth warmed up. Josiah could not hold it in any longer. She had to admit that her cultivation was not as good as Tang's moral integrity. She laughed and hammered Tang's arm. Hee, let's be serious. Were you observing just now? Did you find anything wrong? Woman, you're the one who wants to joke, but you're the one who wants to be serious. You're so hard to please. I was looking at those guys over there. Seeing Josiah raise her small white fist, Tang wisely put away his emotional expression, raised his hand, and pointed to a spot on the opposite side of the red carpet to confess. She raised her fist again, looked over, and suddenly realized, oh, it's those archbishops in red. Why? Is there a problem with them? The Temple of Light was very enthusiastic in this negotiation. Not only did they send 5 or 6 archbishops of noble status, they even rushed over from the south with the intention of acting as a negotiation bridge between the Grey Coat Army and the Bran Empire. Of course, because of Josiah's strong opposition, the bridge was not built. However, even after this face-slapping experience, it still did not dampen the enthusiasm of the temple. As a matter of fact, during the formal negotiation, these archbishops in red appeared again. It's hard to say if there's a problem. Well, were they invited? Of course not. They came on their own. But according to the rules, we can't say anything about it. After all, according to the rules of the empire, the conferring ceremony of a duke and above must be witnessed by the clergy of the temple. It's a special feature just like the sculptures in the temples over there. It's not very useful with them, but it can't be done without them. Shaking his head, Josiah pointed to the white jade sculptures with the religious characteristics of the temple erected outside the central venue. He curled his lips disapprovingly. The main purpose is to declare that the Bran Empire is closely related to royal and divine authority. Oh, so they came uninvited. Tang narrowed his eyes and murmured in a low voice. He instinctively felt that something was wrong here. What did you discover? It's not really a discovery, but it's really interesting. After a pause, Tang raised his wine glass and pointed with his little finger. Do you see the middle-aged man in the white robe with golden threads? The one standing in the corner behind the archbishops in red. If I'm not wrong, he should be a spatial mage. Because of a few skills, Tang now had a good understanding of the concept of space. Although in terms of attack methods, they might not be as varied as a real space magician. But to see if a person understood space? Was he a spatial mage? It shouldn't be a big problem. Spatial mage? Josiah's heart jumped when he heard this, and his expression changed slightly. You mean, not only did they come with bad intentions, but they were also well prepared. They were just waiting to attack and immediately use this person's teleportation to escape? It's possible, but it's just a guess. Maybe the archbishops in red are just afraid of death, so they brought this person. I'm sorry, can I change my wine glass? While talking in a low voice, Tang suddenly called out to the young waiter who was passing by. He turned around and changed his wine glass. His lips didn't move, but his soft voice was heard. Send a message to Luke. Tell him to keep an eye on the middle-aged swindler in the white robe with golden threads in the southwest corner. The waiter's expression didn't change, and he still had a professional and polite smile on his face. After Tang finished changing his wine glass, he bowed slightly and turned to leave. Everything was calm and peaceful. Even though Tang was now the focal point of the scene, no one noticed this extremely normal detail of changing the wine. Except for Josiah, who saw everything, but the latter naturally wouldn't expose him. He pondered for a moment, swirled the magnificent wine in his glass, and walked to the red carpet. Let's go, let's toast. Since His Highness the Second Prince took the initiative to greet us, we shouldn't treat our guests too coldly. It's impolite. Also, he who asked this to be our territory. That's too cruel. Oh, right? What did you say to the Second Prince just now? I've never heard you mention it. It's a secret. You'll find out later. After he finished speaking, Josiah lifted his chin slightly, and his expression gradually calmed down. In a short breath, the aura that Josiah exuded when he stepped onto the red carpet changed drastically. What replaced? It was the arrogance that a victor should have. So he's going to seek revenge. Tang shrugged, and indifferently followed behind Josiah with a glass of wine in his hand. What they bumped into were 4 or 5 nobles who were gathered together and chatting happily. Time is passing too slowly. When will the negotiation agreement be finalized? I don't want to stay here for a moment longer. Yeah, I feel like there's a filthy smell in the air, and the expensive red wine has an earthy smell that can't be suppressed. Just bear with it a little longer, and it'll be over soon. Actually, you don't have to bear with it anymore. The 4 or 5 middle-aged and elderly nobles turned their heads in shock and saw Josiah with an indifferent expression standing in front of them. He raised his glass and made a toast. Sorry, as the host, I didn't treat you well. Well, how about you finish this glass of wine? After you're done, I'll immediately send someone to send you back to the territory south of the Leno River. Silence, silence. Some things were not done because one was too lazy to fuss about it. If one did it, it would be to amuse them. The current Josiah, or rather, the current Gray Coat Army, had the right to be so confident. As for the victor, even if they were a little arrogant, a little overboard, or even humiliated them in front of their faces, the loser had to accept it. There was no other way. Who asked you to be so useless? Of course, this face-slapping job could only be done by Josiah now. The other high-ranking officers of the Gray Coat Army were not suitable. They were unable to move freely in this unfamiliar environment, and their auras were also severely suppressed. It was not necessary for them to do so. However, they were clearly the losers, and yet they were not ashamed of it. Instead, they were ridiculing the victors. There was no such logic in the world, was there? Say, shouldn't they be punished? Let them know whose territory the land they were stepping on belonged to. Soon, the atmosphere in the room changed. At this moment, it was the nobles of the negotiating teams' turn to be stiff and silent. On the other hand, the high-ranking officers of the gray coat army on the side of the red carpet were very excited as they laughed incessantly. Furthermore, they did not pay attention to etiquette, so they brazenly pointed at each other as they gulped down large mouthfuls of wine. It looked like they were enjoying watching a play. Even the bitter red wine in their mouths became tasty. Karma in this lifetime came very quickly indeed, just as Josiah led Tang in a seemingly cordial manner as the host. But in fact, they were crushing their opponents' faces. A few archbishops in the corner of the venue looked up at the same time. They looked at the gloomy white sun that was about to reach their heads and retracted their gazes. They looked at each other and smiled meaningfully. It's about time. The other side should be ready. Why don't we take action now? It's too rushed. I suggest we wait a little longer. Wait for the negotiation agreement to be officially signed. Wait for this group of ignorant mobs to think that they have won and are at their most excited before we quietly launch an attack. Haha, I agree. I also want to see the painful expression on their faces as they suddenly fall from extreme joy to a bottomless abyss. Oh, Father God above, I guess it will be very exciting. I'm really looking forward to it. Chapter 1060. On one side, there was silent mockery, and on the other side, there was a strong slap in the face. There was a back and forth, mixed with some idle chatter and undercurrents. It was noon, with the cheerful sound of string instruments, which were suitable for the atmosphere of the banquet. It suddenly changed into an imposing and majestic movement of trombones and heavy drums. The negotiation officially began. The noble negotiation team and the high-ranking generals of the Gray Coat Army were still standing on both sides of the red carpet. They were either responding to each other or applauding fiercely. Their gazes met as they watched Josiah and the second prince of the empire at the end of the red carpet. Then, they looked at each other, smiled, nodded, and stepped on the red carpet together. Stepping on the scattered petals, they walked toward the high platform in the center under the gazes and applause of the crowd. Josiah looked happy. From time to time, he nodded lightly to the people on both sides of the red carpet to express his gratitude. There was an unconcealable reserved smile at the corner of his mouth. On the other side, although the second prince was the loser and inevitably felt awkward, he was still quite graceful. He did not rush to leave. Instead, he also clapped his hands lightly and walked slowly with Josiah. Putting aside whether his psychological activities were sincere or not, at least he was absolutely passable on the scene. This was the true demeanor of a noble. In comparison, all the talk of biting off teeth and swallowing into the stomach was so weak. Ting Tin, who was standing below the negotiation platform, glanced roughly and smiled. He did not make any comments. He also did not have time to make any comments. His gaze swept across the entire venue without batting an eyelid. Tangen's profession was an assassin. Scheming and plotting in the dark was a professional skill. Therefore, he knew very well that if there was going to be a problem today, it should be at this critical moment. The noble negotiation team did not make any unusual movements. Although most of them looked like they were attending a funeral, there was no underhanded action. There was also no abnormality at the peripheral guards. There was no disturbance. Right, those swindlers narrowing his long and narrow eyes. Tang instantly found his target in the corner of the venue, behind the noble negotiation team. The latter group did not applaud. They stood below the peripheral statue with a calm expression and looked over. It was as if they were really just there to witness and did not make any unusual movements. With a frown, Tang instinctively sensed something strange. The other party's demeanor and actions were too calm. His calmness was mixed with a faint sense of expectation, as if he was waiting for something. He was like a hunter lying in ambush beside a trap. He was very patient and also very cautious as he restrained his dangerous killing intent, lest he startled the prey that was about to walk into the trap. Taking a deep breath, Tang In looked away and made a few subtle gestures with his hands behind his back. At this time and place, before the other party made any dangerous moves, Tang inside naturally could not make a move. However, precautions could be taken. As soon as Tang In finished his gesture, more than a dozen attendants scattered around the periphery of the venue quietly moved. They clapped and silently approached the back of the people from the Divine Hall. The true identities of these attendants were naturally members of the gray space. With them guarding the place, no one would be able to escape their line of sight if they wanted to do anything dangerous. Just when Tang In was slightly relieved upon seeing this, he suddenly heard an uproar, and low exclamations rose and fell one after another. He subconsciously turned his head and was slightly stunned. As mentioned earlier, the details of the conditions and so on for this negotiation had already been finalized beforehand. Therefore, this grand negotiation in front of him was, in fact, a simple 2 agenda items. The first was to officially sign the agreed agreement. The second was for Josiah to accept Bran's conferment and wear the crown that symbolized the king of the north. There was no problem with the first agenda item. While Tang In was observing the group of charlatans, Josiah and the second prince walked up the steps and officially signed the agreement. The second agenda item that caused the uproar was the second agenda item. On the high platform, the second prince stretched out his hands and froze in a pose of giving something. He looked dazed, because the crown that had just been taken out and had yet to be given out was not in his hands now. Instead, it was taken directly by Josiah and casually held in his hands. Below, Fry and the other high-ranking generals of the Gray Coat Army were stunned. Obviously, they did not know about this beforehand and were momentarily caught off guard. As for the aristocratic negotiation team on the other side, after witnessing Josiah's obviously rude behavior, they were instantly enraged. Ridiculous! How dare you? How dare you? Isn't he from a noble family? Why doesn't he know the rules at all? Even if he doesn't kneel down to receive it, he can't be so presumptuous. What is this? Is he robbing? Ha! Coming back to his senses, Tang In shook his head and grinned silently. Is this what you meant by, I have my own principles? Sure enough, it was sharp. On the high platform, Josiah's expression was indifferent, as if he did not hear the reprimands and doubts below. He weighed the luxurious crown in his hands and calmly said, "Thank you, Your Highness, for sending the congratulatory gift from thousands of miles away. I received it and am very happy." That's it, that's all. But please note the words Josiah used. It was a congratulatory gift. It was not a conferment, nor was it a reward. This meant that the reason why Bran sent the crown was not to confer Josiah the title of King of the North. Instead, it was because after the Gray Coat Army conquered the North, he sent a congratulatory gift to her, the leader, as the icing on the cake. From another perspective, Josiah's actions meant that now the North belonged to the Gray Coat Army. This result was not bestowed by the Bran, but by the Gray Coat Army. It was snatched from the Bran by the Bran, just like how I snatched this crown from the second prince's hands. This was called a spoil of war, not a superfluous conferment of a title. As soon as he finished speaking, the higher-ups of the Gray Coat Army reacted and were instantly agitated. They immediately taunted the crowd opposite them. "Haha, well said, leader. This stupid crown is a congratulatory gift. Look at how petty you are. Robbing? So what if we are robbing you? If you don't like it, you can take it back." "That's right, if you don't like it, bring out your army and fight with us." "Why bring out your army? I think it's better to fight now." "Hey, don't say that we are bullying you. Guards outside, listen up. No one is allowed to come in to help later." When it came to scolding people, the noble negotiation team, which was particular about elegance, could not be a match for the higher-ups of the Gray Coat Army, even if their faces were red and they could think of all kinds of profanities. When it came to fighting, the higher-ups of the Gray Coat Army who rolled up their sleeves and waved their fists around were even more fearless. They could defeat the noble negotiation team by a few streets without any hesitation. Thus, in a short moment, The atmosphere of the venue reached a chaotic climax for the first time. Of course, it was impossible to really rush over and fight with bare hands. After all, everyone was a person of status. Therefore, after a while, shoes, hats, and small potted plants that could be moved around became the most suitable weapons. For a moment, the red carpet was filled with shoes and hats flying in the air, flowers and plants coming and going. It was a wonderful scene. The only two people who had the ability to suppress the atmosphere stood on the high platform, but they did not react at all. Josiah was expressionless and indifferent. What kind of joke was this? Now, the Gray Coat Army had the advantage. Why should they stop? As for the second prince, he was truly dumbfounded. Even though he was of noble birth and his means were not bad, he had never seen such a bizarre scene. He was momentarily stunned and speechless. The only person who could still maintain his calm was Tang Yin. As he swayed his body on the spot, he calmly dodged all kinds of hidden weapons that were flying at him. From the corner of his eyes, he locked onto the charlatan. The latter was clearly caught off guard by the sudden turn of events. A few archbishops looked at the chaotic venue in a daze. Moments later, they retracted their gazes and looked at each other. They shook their heads speechlessly. Following that, they nodded their heads gently. The corners of their mouths curled up as though they had decided on something. Instantly, a cold, sharp, and dangerous feeling exploded in Tang Yin's heart. Suddenly, he turned his head and saw the few archbishops reach out their palms at the same time and land them on the white jade sculptures behind them. Even though the alarm bells in his heart were ringing rapidly, Tang Yin could not help but be stunned when he saw this. He subconsciously looked at the few white jade sculptures and was puzzled. Was there a problem with these things? There shouldn't be a problem. This was because every piece of construction material in the venue had been checked by the members of the Gray Space several times. Ignoring the possibility of hiding knives, spears, and staffs, it was impossible for there to be an explosive crystal the size of a palm. And if even Tang Yin thought so, the members of the Gray Space who were behind the people from the temple naturally could not see any clues. They watched in confusion as the archbishops reached out their palms and patted the white jade sculptures as though they had accidentally touched them. That's not right. After being stunned for a moment, Tang Yin's expression changed drastically. It was not because he could tell what the archbishops were up to, but because he suddenly realized that the sculptures they were patting were sculptures with a strong religious theme. Of course, this could not be a coincidence. There were dozens of decorative sculptures in and out of the venue with different themes. Only these few were related to the temple, and the sculptures that the archbishops were patting were exactly these few. As such, it would be strange to say that there was nothing wrong with them. It was complicated to say, but how long would it take to pat them lightly? It was only the time of a breath. In the noisy venue, on the high platform, the second prince, who had regained his senses, waved his hand while sweating profusely. Calm down, everyone calm down. Leader Josiah, please restrain the actions of your subordinates. Before the clamor died down, it was suddenly suppressed by a loud roar. Harry, destroy those few sculptures. Outside the venue, Harry, who was dressed as an attendant, was happily watching the Gray Coat Army gain the upper hand in the venue. He was just short of applauding. When he heard his name, he subconsciously looked up and saw his boss pointing at the sculptures behind the people from the temple with a solemn face and leaping onto the high platform. His plump figure immediately trembled. Without thinking, he flipped his hand and flashed a short dagger, roaring as he pounced forward. Do it! Attack! Block them! Be careful! Protect the Lord! Those who block me will die. The Gray Coat Army dares to attack. What's the situation? In the blink of an eye, no one knew what had happened. The members of the Gray Space who were disguised as attendants were the first to attack under Harry's orders. Then, the people from the temple were the first to react. The expressions of the archbishops changed drastically. They ordered the accompanying knights to go forward and block as they retreated. Then, the guards of the aristocratic negotiation team regained their senses. When they saw more than 10 attendants pulling out short daggers and pouncing towards the venue, they thought that the Gray Coat Army was planning to take advantage of them. They hurriedly rushed into the venue to protect their master, Finally, the aristocrats and the high-ranking generals of the Gray Coat Army, who were happily scolding in the venue, looked at the back with a blank expression. They had no idea what had happened. Chapter 1061. Although it was a negotiation, they were still on opposite sides. Therefore, when the situation suddenly changed, the people in the field were not afraid to speculate their opponents with the most vicious thoughts, and subconsciously made the choice that was most beneficial to their own interests. Therefore, in a short moment, the outside of the field was in a mess. Around a few religious-themed statues, the members of the Gray Space, the Temple Guard Knights, and the aristocratic guards who rushed in. The three sides were tangled together, and only the fierce collision of weapons and the continuous roars and screams could be heard. It was difficult to tell who was who, not to mention who was friend and who was foe. Those involved could not see clearly, and the onlookers could not see clearly. On the high platform, Joshua and the second prince looked down from above. Naturally, they saw the chaos from the beginning to the end. However, this did not mean anything. They retracted their gazes and turned to look at each other. Their expressions were cold, and they subconsciously stepped back. You Bran? You Gray Coat Army? Damn it. You Gray Coat Army have guts. When it came to instantaneous reaction, ordinary people were naturally not as good as warriors who had experienced hundreds of battles. Before Josiah and the second prince could question each other, the second prince's personal guard, who was also a royal consecrator, was instantly furious. He stepped forward and protected the second prince behind him. Then he angrily attacked, and one of his palms was covered by the fighting light of thunder. Go away. Before the fighting light of thunder landed, a faint figure flashed in front of Josiah like a ghost. He raised his hand slowly, and a blood-red demonic blade flashed in an instant and cut the old man's wrist. Needless to say, this was Tang. Others needed time to react, but he, the source of the chaos, certainly did not. Get out of the way. The second prince saw it clearly from the side and immediately cried out in alarm. He did not know what realm Twain's strength had reached, but judging from the other party's valiant record of being able to retreat unscathed under Wooding's sword, it was not something a mere royal family consecrator could resist. Even the second prince, a dabbler in martial arts, could sense it. Of course, the imperial family consecrator who attacked was even more aware of the terrifying danger hidden in the strange blade. His expression changed abruptly, and he withdrew his hand and retreated, decisively giving up the attack. However, no matter how fast he retreated, Tang did not intend to let him go just because he attacked Josiah. He took another step forward and raised his blade even faster. In the next moment, with a chi sound, blood shot up into the sky. A strong gust of wind suddenly blew in front of his body. His whip leg was like a shadow, directly kicking his lower abdomen. A loud bang was mixed with the terrifying sound of bones breaking. A large cloud of blood wrapped around his body as he flew back in the air and rolled off the stage. Victory and defeat had been decided. Tang was not surprised at all when he defeated the consecrated expert in one move. In fact, he did not look at the result after he made his move. He kept staring at the periphery of the venue from the corner of his eyes. Over there, Harry and others who took the lead to attack were like tigers in a flock of sheep. They had the upper hand. Even if there were knights of Divinity Temple in front of them and aristocratic guards behind them, no one could stop an assassin's swift and violent attack in such a narrow area. Not to mention that this assassin came from the Gray Space. Just at the moment when the Imperial family consecrator was kicked out, Harry had already succeeded. His fat body stepped on the shoulder of a knight of Divinity Temple, and he jumped up like a civet cat. He raised his hand and directly chopped off the head of a goddess statue. What on earth do you Gray Coat Army want to do? Turning around, the second prince, who was protected by several imperial family consecrators, was extraordinarily courageous. He was not frightened by Tang-An's ferocious attack, nor did he listen to others' advice to retreat. He stood where he was, looked straight at Josiah with a livid face, and asked in a loud voice, "Is this your negotiation sincerity?" Josiah crossed his arms and remained silent. The current chaos was indeed caused by Tang Un's violent roar, and they were in the wrong. However, she believed in Tang Un's judgment. Tang Un looked at the second prince's angry expression, which did not seem to be fake. His heart skipped a beat, and he was about to open his mouth to ask a question. Suddenly, the flags of the Brand's palace and the gray coat army around the venue suddenly fluttered, although there was no wind. Then, everyone in the venue felt their bodies suddenly become heavier, as if a millstone had suddenly appeared on their backs. It was so heavy that they could not breathe. Ouch! People who had combat energy or magic power were still fine. Even if they were heavily burdened, they would not make a fool of themselves on the spot. For example, the members of the gray coat army who jumped into the air not far away. Even though their bodies were slightly swaying in the air, they still insisted on kicking over the statue before falling to the ground. However, the people from the noble negotiation group and the high-ranking elder from the gray coat army could not stand it anymore. Their legs went soft, and they were the first to fall to the ground. They looked really embarrassed. It was not only the venue that was affected. As far as the eyes could see, the roof tiles of the surrounding town seemed to be suddenly cast by magic. At first, they trembled slightly, but soon they jumped violently. The clattering sound was mixed with the faint screams of the town residents from all directions. The tiles randomly reflected the dim light of the sun in the sky. It was grotesque and variegated, as if it was a sign before the end of the world. It was terrifying. What's going on? Coercion. This is coercion. Impossible. What kind of coercion can cover the whole town? It can't be an earthquake. In the midst of the confused guesses, the people in the venue panicked. It cannot be said that they had not seen the world. Whether it was the nobles who had seen the prosperity of the world, or the high-ranking generals of the gray coat army who had personally experienced the Battle of Kukwa, they could all be said to have rich experience. But even so, they had never seen such a terrifying scene. It was as if the whole town was hiding an active volcano that was about to erupt, or as if the whole town was at the mouth of an evil dragon, trembling and struggling in vain. Tang did not panic. Or more accurately, when he realized that there was something wrong with the statues, he was already mentally prepared. He looked up at the sky. It was indeed coercion, and if he did not guess wrongly, this was the coercion of a big move that was about to arrive and not some natural disaster. And the source of the coercion was the sky above. But perhaps it was because it was in the early stages, the sky was still dim and no abnormalities could be seen. Without hesitation, he retracted his gaze and turned to look at the few archbishops who had retreated to the corner. They laughed maniacally. "Ah, foolish and ignorant mortals. Do you know that this is the supreme power of God?" Perhaps knowing that his little trick had been exposed, under the baffled gazes of the crowd, one of the archbishops looked down at his surroundings. A cruel smile suffused the corners of his mouth as he waved his hand and laughed. While you can still open your mouth, scream as much as you want and enjoy this boundless fear. You have nowhere to hide, nor can you resist. You are destined to be reduced to dust under God's punishment along with this maple town. Ha! My lord. What do you mean? Are you, joking? Some of the nobles came back to their senses when they heard this. They looked at the archbishops in a daze, unable to believe what they had just understood. Act. Continue acting. Idiot, isn't this obvious enough? Do you really not know? The high-ranking generals of the gray coat army were also stunned after subconsciously mocking them. They looked at the group of nobles in a daze and suddenly laughed. So it's an internal conflict. Interesting, very interesting. These charlatans want to kill all of you as well. Idiots. It's really you. Tang took a deep breath. His expression was unperturbed, but the rock in his heart was gradually sinking. The situation at hand was obvious. Since this powerful move that had yet to materialize had already enveloped the entire town, its power was definitely not weak. Under such a large-scale killing move, what he could do was extremely limited. He could not save many people, unless he could quickly find and kill the person who created this powerful move. With this thought in mind, Tang In quickly swept his gaze towards the few statues that had caused the anomaly. But at this moment, there were loud bangs as the gravity increased once again. This time, the ones who collapsed were the ordinary guards. Some of them were on the side of the nobles, while others were on the side of the gray coat army. They raised their heads and roared in indignation. They struggled to get up, but they were pressed to the ground by an invisible force, unable to put up any resistance. Not far away, Harry, who was destroying the statues, also swayed. The short dagger in his hand could not be swung down. He turned his head to look blankly at Tang Un. There were a total of 6 statues, but they had already destroyed half of them. However, the pressure on them did not lessen at all. Instead, it increased. Could this thing still be destroyed? The arch-cardinal shook his head and laughed again. His face was filled with mockery. Foolish, foolish, a bunch of fools. I already told you that this is the power of God. How can it be so easily destroyed by mortals like you? Pause for a while seemed to recall something as he sized up Tang In from afar. You're that Tang In, right? Haha. I heard that your movement techniques are outstanding and that you were extremely fast. Tang In did not have the time to bother with him. He looked into the distance as he knitted his brows tightly. He constantly sensed the source of the danger. If there was an attack, there was definitely an enemy. This was nonsense, but it was also the truth. And the attacks could be roughly divided into 2 types. One was close combat, and the other was long range. From the present situation, it was impossible for it to be close combat. It could only be a long-range attack. Connecting it to the style of the temple, it was definitely a magical attack. As expected, perhaps the arch-cardinal felt that the situation was under his control and that it would lack the thrill of quietly killing the opponent. He said again, "We're the people who are looking for us." Haha, I'm not afraid to tell you. Tang In, the people you are looking for are at least 30 kilometers away. They are an elite mage regiment from the temple headquarters. They arrived here through a temporary small-scale, long-range teleportation portal. Aren't you very fast? You can try looking for them. 30 kilometers. Tang In licked his dry lips. He did not know how to react. It was no wonder that no matter how he investigated, he could not find any problems. The danger was not in the town, nor was it in the surrounding hills or rivers. It was 30 kilometers away. How the hell was he going to investigate? Stop joking. Even an army marching on the battlefield would not have a scouting range of more than 10 kilometers. No matter what magic it is impossible for it to have an attack range of 30 kilometers. On the high platform, Josiah, who had calmed down, questioned coldly, "Oh, I forgot that there was a mage here." The arch-cardinal smiled and answered proudly, "Of course it is impossible with ordinary magic, but what if it was sent here through an ancient spell formation?" Another ancient spell formation. Josiah frowned. She was a mage herself, so of course she knew that once the ancient prefix was added to the already mysterious magic, it could not be understood with common sense. But after thinking about it, she shook her head. Even with an ancient spell formation, it would not work. How are you going to lock onto the target? This was the key. Magic was mysterious and unpredictable, but no matter how long range it was, there was always a distance limit. Beyond this distance, even if the magic could reach, how could it ensure that the attack was accurate? However, the moment Josiah asked this, Tang In, who was at the side, was slightly shocked. He subconsciously raised his head and looked at the few white jade statues again. He did not notice it earlier, but now that it was shattered and reflected against the limestone floor, he realized that the fragments were faintly emitting a gentle white glow that was not noticeable. "Oh, you noticed it?" Noticing where Tang In was looking, the arch-cardinal smiled proudly. "That's right. These few statues are used to point out the direction. The materials used to construct them are somewhat special and rare. Usually, they're just ordinary objects, but if they're slightly triggered with light magic, they will automatically react. Even if they shatter, it will not matter. Haha, it is laughable that you ignorant fools have been inspecting here for days without realizing that the real danger is right under your noses." Tang In was speechless. Harry, who was in charge of inspecting the materials in the venue, was also speechless. They cannot be blamed for this. The world was huge, and there were all kinds of rare treasures. Not to mention that they did not know much about magical materials. It was even more out of the question for such a rare and unpopular material. Didn't they see that Josiah, who was a mage, was also at a loss when he heard this? This was really not something they were good at. No wonder you were so enthusiastic when you gathered the craftsmen and gathered the materials to set up the venue. In the silence, the second prince clenched his fists tightly and looked at the archcardinal. So you wanted to mix these special statues with the decorations and transport them here. That's right. The archcardinal smiled indifferently. I'm sorry, Your Highness, but you will have to die here today. Pause for a while pointed at Josiah and Tangan. Of course, the culprits are this group of rioting bandits. As soon as he finished speaking, the group of noble negotiators who were pinned to the ground immediately cursed. Bastard, are you crazy? Traitors, traitors, you have been supported by the Empire for so many years, yet you have committed such despicable acts that are tantamount to treason. The Imperial Court will not let you off. Amidst the cursing, the Grey Coat Army could not help but look at each other in shock and horror. There really was internal strife, and it was a rebellion in the Temple of Light. The corner of the second prince's eyes twitched, but his expression did not change much when he heard this, as if he had already expected it. He sneered sarcastically. It was my elder brother's idea, right? Humph, I didn't expect you to choose this brood in the end. Of course, the archcardinals did not care about these curses. On the contrary, they were enjoying it now. Whether he is a brute or not is not important. What is important is that he does not harm the interests of the Temple of Light. On this point, perhaps Your Highness the Second Prince should really learn from your boorish elder brother. He shook his head. You shouldn't have negotiated with the Grey Coat Army. Otherwise, we wouldn't have made a decision so quickly. This was the crux of the problem. Bran now had two enemies, the Northern Wilderness tribes and the Grey Coat Army. To put it bluntly, even if the Empire fell one day, the people would not die, and the nobles would not be completely wiped out. However, only the Temple of Light would die without a burial place. This was because whether it was the Grey Coat Army or the barbarian sect of the Northern Wilderness tribes, they all hated the Temple of Light, who was constantly playing tricks behind their backs. As such, the Temple of Light would naturally not sit by and watch the Empire and the Grey Coat Army negotiate peace. The second prince curled his lips in disdain. Learn from him. He will only lead the Empire to destruction, or it will be completely devoured by you greedy vermin of the Empire. Ah, well said. The winner was always generous. Instead of being angry, the archcardinals shrugged in a relaxed manner. That is why we chose the first prince and not you, Your Highness. Now, it seems that this is an extremely wise decision. Pause for a while and inadvertently looked back. The white-robed, golden-edged, middle-aged man who was hiding behind the archcardinals nodded and immediately clapped his hands and laughed. All right, let's stop here. I will let you know the inside story so that you won't die in a daze. This is the limit of what we can do. No need to thank me. This is a gift from Father God. With that, he raised his hand and made a prayer gesture in front of him. Despite the constant cursing around him, his expression was still benevolent and extremely pious. At this moment, an indifferent voice interrupted. Are you done? Chapter 1062. Are you done? Countless classic tragic cases had long proven an irrefutable truth, and that was the side that had the absolute upper hand should never talk nonsense or be arrogant. It was best to directly kill the opponent with a single blow. Otherwise, the ending was destined to be another bloody and tragic case. Of course, to be honest, the archcardinal's actions were not blindly arrogant. The reason why he had revealed all his plans and schemes was mainly to attract everyone's attention, so as to allow his companions behind him to cast their teleportation spells without being disturbed. Unfortunately, his acting skills were useless in the eyes of Tang Yin. How could Tang Yin, who already knew that there was a spatial magician in the opposing team, turn a blind eye to it? The reason why he did not interrupt and was not in a hurry to take action was because the sky above him was undergoing a drastic change. That's right. While the arch-cardinals were delightfully recounting the cause and effect, constantly attracting hatred, Tang Yin's attention was constantly focused on the quietly changing sky. The most obvious change was the disappearance of the gloomy sun that hung in the sky. The surroundings of the town gradually turned dark and gloomy. No, to be more precise, a faint and majestic phantom appeared out of thin air. It completely blocked out the gloomy sun's rays and cast a large shadow that directly enveloped the town. As he observed, the phantom rapidly solidified. Although he could not see the full picture, he could roughly make out its outline. It looked like a giant with a heavy sword in its hand. Waves of suppressive force emanated from it, like solid water ripples. It was terrifying to look at. However, what was the large shadow on both sides of its body? A cloak? Or wings? Could it not be a human? Without waiting for him to continue observing, Tang Yin temporarily retracted his gaze when he noticed that the arch-cardinal had the intention to escape. Only then did he interject indifferently. "Are you done?" The arch-cardinal paused midway as he turned his head to look at Tang Yin, who had a calm expression. He frowned slightly before coming to a realization. Why? Does His Excellency Tang Yin still have something to say? Or, haha, do you want to make us stay? This was courting death. If his previous actions were to act as a pretense, it could be pardoned, but this provocative stance was truly a result of him being blinded by his advantage. Of course, perhaps the arch-cardinal believed that he had the qualifications to be provocative. After all, which red-robed archbishop wasn't a magus? In other words, there were 6 archmages overseeing this place. Even if they lacked experience in fighting, they would have no problem holding back for a while. More importantly, they didn't have to worry about the future. However, Tang Yin was annoyed at this moment. Before the arch-cardinal could reply, he continued his arrogance and casually interrupted him. "Leave all of you behind. Why would I need to do anything?" With that said, there was a shrill whistle. Quick, extremely fast. Before the red-robed archbishops could turn their heads in shock, a phantom image tore through the air at a speed that was indiscernible to the naked eye. It swept past the guards on the perimeter, past the tottering statues, past the knights. Finally, with a bang, it accurately sank into the back of the white-robed, middle-aged man's head, splattering blood everywhere. It was fine if it did not make a move, but once he made a move, it was a headshot, a one-shot kill. Without a doubt, the only person with such superb archery skills in the gray space was Archer Marquis Luke. The red-robed archbishops were dumbfounded. They subconsciously wiped their faces and bodies that were splashed with red and white sticky liquid. They stared blankly at their companion, who was holding a magic wand and had one foot in the void. Their broken faces were filled with indignation as they collapsed. Clearly, the latter had sensed the danger, but the arrow was too fast. Before he could completely teleport into the void, he was already dead. Of course, it didn't matter if he died. The key was, who the hell was going to take them away now? His ultimate move didn't recognize people. Capture them. The second prince reacted quickly when he saw this. He immediately waved his hand and roared. The royal consecrators beside him also reacted. They didn't have Tang Yin's ability to teleport, so they weren't confident that they could escape with His Highness and the other nobles. As such, it was naturally safer to capture the other party and interrogate him. In an instant, several royal consecrators pounced forward and surrounded the red-robed archbishops, sealing off all their escape routes with unfriendly expressions. But at that moment, before they could interrogate him, all of a sudden, Tang Yin's expression changed. He retreated back to Josiah's side and looked up at the sky. At the same time, the second prince's handsome face suddenly flushed red. His body swayed from side to side as if he was drunk. He couldn't hold on any longer and sat down on the high platform. The sky suddenly darkened and the surroundings were gloomy. Whoosh! Boom! Boom! Everything in sight, the town's buildings, the city walls, and so on, suddenly became a few inches shorter. Then they trembled, collapsed, and twisted as dust flew up. Occasionally, there were broken window frames mixed in as they flew wantonly in the air. The scene was spectacular. If the previous pressure was like a millstone, then after a short moment, it was like a mountain peak. How could anyone endure such a thing? Outside the field, whether it was the Temple Knights or the Gray Coat Army Guards, they were all pressed to the ground, unable to move at all. The elders in the upper echelons of the Gray Coat Army and the noble negotiation team had already fainted. It was likely that the townsfolk further away were the same. Only Fry and a few other high-ranking warrior generals were sweating profusely under the violent fighting aura. Although they could barely stand, anyone could tell that they wouldn't be able to last much longer, and this was merely the pressure of his aura. What the hell is this? Looking up at the increasingly solid phantom in the sky, Tang In felt even more uncertain. Perhaps only he and the few consecrators of the royal family, and the 6 arch-cardinals who were being surrounded, could truly understand the horror of the phantom. This kind of pressure was already close to Wu Ding's terrifying sword technique. There was no chance of luck in resisting it head-on. Of course, it was only impossible to resist it. Avoiding it was not a problem. After all, since the red-robed archbishops could think of using spatial magic to escape, Tang In could naturally do the same with his Permethaw blink. It was just that he wouldn't be able to save many people. In the terrifying silence, David and the other members of the Gray Space gathered silently behind Tang In. They brought Fry, Fei Rue, and Little Carol. If Tang In wanted to leave, this was probably all he could save. Tang In did not move. Teleportation was only a matter of seconds, so he was unwilling to leave so easily until the last moment. Moreover, if he left, it would basically mean that the Gray Coat Army superstructure would be destroyed in an instant. Even if Josiah and Fry could survive, they would only be commanders without men. He did not interrogate the surrounded red-robed archbishops. Under such circumstances, it was impossible for them to lie. As such, there was no need to interrogate them. After all, the real enemy was in a corner 30 kilometers away. Even if he cut them into pieces now, it would be useless. Tang In stayed here because he wanted to see with his own eyes what the ultimate move looked like after it was formed, and whether there were any flaws to exploit. If there was really nothing else he could do, then he could only leave. But of course, Tang In did not care about those frauds who were overjoyed. There would naturally be someone to interrogate them on his behalf. It should be known that in addition to the high-ranking generals of the Gray Coat Army, there was also the second prince and a group of prominent aristocratic negotiators. If the latter all died here, it would not be a small joke. Haha. You can't escape. You can't escape. All of you will die here, including me. Haha. Perhaps it was because of the sudden change in status from a controller to a prisoner. The difference was too great, but one of the red-robed archbishops seemed to have gone crazy. His old face twisted in despair, and he roared with ear-piercing laughter. Do you know what the temple's elite mage group is? Do you know what God's punishment is? Do you know what F***CK? Without waiting for the long-winded old faker to announce the answer, Tang In and the others, who had been looking up at the sky, suddenly widened their eyes. Their mouths formed a funny O shape, and they were dumbfounded on the spot. What the F***CK? Did it really grow wings? That's right. The giant figure suspended in midair had revealed most of its true body. It held a pitch-black, heavy sword in its hand, and its body stood tall, majestic and tall. However, its face was extremely feminine, and its long, bright golden hair was draped over its back, making it difficult to distinguish its gender. Well, that was not the main point. The main point was that the 2 shadows on the giant's back were actually a pair of wings. Black on the left and white on the right, they covered the sky, strange and eye-catching. Stunned for a moment. This thing, opening his mouth, Tang In turned his head stiffly to look at Josiah, who was also stunned, and asked uncertainly, "Birdman, angel?" That was unprofessional. No matter how one looked at it, the thing in front of them did indeed look like the angel in Tang In's impression. But the reality was that there was no concept of an angel in the other world. At least there was no such name. In the other world, the professional name of this thing was Emissary, Fallen. Emissary of the Fallen. Meredith. On a mountain road dozens of kilometers away, Owens, who was galloping wildly on his horse, looked up and almost fell off the horse. His face was full of horror, as if he had seen a ghost in broad daylight, and he gasped. Then, he frantically whipped the horse under him. Crazy, the temple is crazy. It's over, it's over, it's over. Hurry, 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 it's too late. Emissary of the Fallen May. May what? In the venue, Tang Un's ears twitched, and he turned to look at Josiah blankly. Meredith. Josiah's face was a little pale, but his tone of explanation was still calm. It's a mythical figure in the temple's teachings. Legend has it that it was the highest position and strongest emissary under the god of light. But because of its nobility, it tried in vain to be equal to the gods and was reprimanded repeatedly. In anger, it led its subordinates to raise the flag of rebellion. But in the end, it failed and was personally sent to the abyss of hell by the god of light. That's why it was called the emissary of the fallen. Understood, it was a wretched person who tried to get rid of the big boss, but failed in the end. Tang In nodded in understanding, and then the corner of his mouth twitched. He completely gave up. Mythical figures and whatnot were ultimately false, and Tang In did not believe it. But this Meredith in front of him was indeed not one of those impressive-looking but useless idle phantoms that he had once created. This was a pure spiritual body, a little similar to Bamata's nine-headed beast. There was definitely no such thing in the real world, but if you treated it as if it did not exist at all and accidentally got hit, you would be dead without any suspense. Glancing at the red-clothed huckster who was surrounded, Tang Un's heart skipped a beat, and he could not help but sigh inwardly. This was really deliberate. This Meredith must have been created by the temple, but hearing this thing's nickname as the emissary of the fallen, he knew that the attack later would definitely be based on the power of darkness. In other words, even if someone suspected and investigated later, they would not be able to find traces of the Temple of Light's actions at the scene. To be able to come up with such a perfect way to frame someone, the temple was really going all out. With a wry smile, Meredith, who had revealed its true form, moved. With a swing of its sword, the wind and clouds changed color, and the world dimmed. Rumble, 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 like waves of rolling thunder, the battle song resounded in all directions. I will be like a god, slaughter all the people in the world. Chapter 1063. I will be like a god, slaughtering all the people in the world. All right, this deplorable person's resentment was really deep. Listening to this inhuman roar and thinking about Meredith's life story, Tang In couldn't help but smack his lips and sigh inwardly. Without hesitation, he waved his hand and shouted, "Permitha teleportation. Go!" His fingers swiped down in the air like a sharp blade, slicing through the surface of the water. Suddenly, ripples appeared out of thin air a foot in front of him. Instantly, a pitch-black pattern appeared. Then, in a short breath, it rapidly expanded horizontally like a bloody mouth that was constantly expanding. If it was just Tang In alone, there was naturally no need to mobilize so many people. With a thought, he could escape into the void and escape in an instant. But now there were dozens of people here. Tang In naturally had to open a space passage in advance so that everyone could enter one by one. To be honest, it was also the first time Tang In brought people to teleport, so he was very nervous. If not for the previous battle on the river, where Tang In was forced to step into the spatial turbulence and luckily came out from the eastern coastline, which could be considered as having accumulated some experience, he really would not have dared to try this. Of course, in this life and death moment, even if he wasn't confident, he had to bite the bullet. But at this moment, suddenly, "Boss, be careful." A strong wind blew, and the fighting aura was violent. David's expression changed drastically. It turned out that when one of the imperial family's consecrators saw that a space passage was opened, he immediately had the greedy thought of occupying it. He immediately abandoned the crazy con man and stepped forward without thinking, brandishing his sword. In the blink of an eye, The sharp sword had already reached Tang Un's back. The speed of the sword was extremely fast, and the timing was just right. Most importantly, the choice was not wrong. The terrifying Meredith in the air only had to raise her sword, and Tang Un had to kneel when he saw the power, let alone these imperial family's consecrators. So the situation was very simple. Whoever stayed would die. And in such a crisis, as long as there was a chance of survival, naturally everyone would want to occupy it alone. But his mistake was that he shouldn't have chosen Tang Un to attack. "You're courting death." Tang Un didn't turn around. The corners of his mouth twitched slightly as he spat out these cold words with an expressionless face. In the next moment, the Domang longsword accurately pierced Tang Un's back, penetrating through in an instant, and piercing towards Josiah, who was in front of Tang Un. It was also at this moment that the smile on the imperial consecrator's face froze. His pupils constricted rapidly, and they were filled with fear and bewilderment. It wasn't just because of the feeling of emptiness that came from the body of the sword. More importantly, the tip of the sword felt as if it had collided with a mountain, unable to move an inch further. Even his body became sluggish, unable to move at all. Of course, the above was only what the imperial consecrator felt. In the eyes of others, it looked as if he had swung his sword to launch a sneak attack and successfully pierced through Twain's body. Then an ordinary blade suddenly flashed past his back and lightly leaped onto his neck. With a horizontal pull, the crisp sound of Twain's throat bone cracking could be heard. Their silhouettes intertwined. Whoosh, the round object was thrown to the left, while the silhouettes flew to the right. What connected them was a floating stream of blood, like a red banner. It was natural and shocking to the eye. Stepping forward, turning around, and killing intent was released. Indifferently looking at the imperial consecrators who quickly gathered around and suddenly stopped because of the tragic sight of their companion's corpse, Tang Un casually shook off the blood beads on his dagger. His expression was as calm as water. Those who take one step forward die. Shadow Doppelganger and Slaughter Feast stacked together in exchange for a great head of a void-level powerhouse. This was to establish his power. The scene instantly went silent. The few imperial consecrators felt suffocated when they heard this. An icy cold, killing intent covered the heavens and the earth as it pressed down. Their expressions instantly went pale as they subconsciously took a step back in unison, and they were extremely terrified. Just a simple face-to-face confrontation, and a void-level powerhouse fell just like that. What kind of terrifying combat power was this? They couldn't estimate, and they didn't dare to test and estimate anymore. The greed that had just risen in their hearts was instantly drowned by great fear. "It's you, Night Demon Tang Un." Feeling the cold, killing intent that could almost completely crush people's nerves, one of the imperial consecrators glanced at the dark dagger in Tang Un's hand. His expression changed again, and he exclaimed involuntarily. The other imperial consecrators' faces also turned pale, as if they remembered something. They looked at Tang Un with even more horror. "Night Demon." Tang Un was stunned when he heard this, and he couldn't help but frown slightly. "This is a nickname? I'm King Voldemort. What kind of stupid nickname is this?" What Tang Un didn't know was that his name might not be prominent elsewhere because of his habit of keeping a low profile, but in the Imperial Court Consecrator's Hall, he was famous for being a fierce person. Think about it, the Imperial Consecrators that when Sillin had brought out of the encirclement, as well as the Imperial Consecrators that had accompanied Wu Ding not long ago, added up to at least 2 digits of consecrators that had died in his hands. The void-level powerhouses that were originally rare existences were like slaughtering chickens and sheep in his hands, one after another. Thus, his name naturally became known to the rest of the consecrators, including the unique dagger that Lena had made for him. Because of this, they gave him a fierce name, Dark Night Demon. Night referred to Tang Un's assassin style. As for demon, on one hand, it said that Tang Un was like a demon when he killed people. His hands were covered in blood, and the souls of the dead hung on his body. On the other hand, it also pointed out his combat habits. It was like the teleportation of a space magician, and it was impossible to guard against. Well, even if Tang In did not buy this nickname, he still had to admit it. But a person's name was like a tree's shadow. The rest of the Imperial consecrators completely dispelled the idea of getting lucky in their hearts. They watched as Tang In gathered the people again and came to the entrance of the space that was about the height of a person. They didn't dare to make the slightest move. Dark, Tang In, Your Excellency. After hesitating for a while, one of the Imperial consecrators braced himself and spoke in a pleading tone. I didn't know it was you before. Please forgive me for offending you. And, no matter what, His Highness the Second Prince didn't offend you, so he probably didn't understand Tang In's personality, so his words were very hesitant, and he didn't have the confidence to plead. But of course, Tang In could understand his intentions, but he didn't look at the second prince who was lying on the side, struggling to breathe. He said calmly, I can't even protect myself, and the Gray Coat Army couldn't even save all of my own people. Do you think I'll save someone unrelated to me? But the second prince, he's His Excellency Philip's friend. Since his request didn't work, he tried to use the favor card. Luckily, he could immediately remember the relationship between Tang Un and Philip. Tang In laughed when he heard this, then shook his head indifferently. If Philip is here, I'll save him. But others I won't save. Pausing for a moment, he waved his hand and said, I advise you not to have any ideas about me. Why don't you take advantage of the fact that the thing above hasn't gone berserk and leave with your second prince as soon as possible? Who knows, you might be able to escape this calamity. As soon as he finished speaking, he beckoned Joshua and the others to hold hands and walk into the space passage, ignoring them. This wasn't the time to lend a hand just because of a favor. Tang In paid a lot of attention to the people around him. Whether it was family or friendship, as long as they acknowledged it, he would never be stingy in lending a helping hand. But unfortunately, the second prince, whom he met for the first time, clearly did not belong to this category. Even if his impression of him was good, even if the second prince's attitude was indeed very good, but that was it. They were strangers who met by chance and nodded at each other. Moreover, the Gray Coat Army's high-ranking generals who had fainted now, even if their relationship with Tang Un was ordinary, they would still see each other frequently. Their level of intimacy was definitely higher than that of the second prince. Even Tang In couldn't save them, let alone this unrelated second prince at this moment. You still want to escape this disaster? Just them? Ha! Just as the remaining high priests of the royal family were in despair, the 6 archbishops in red who didn't escape despite being unattended seemed to have heard the funniest joke. They laughed maniacally. Under the sword of the fallen emissary, everything within a radius of 10 miles will be annihilated. Just these boorish people want to escape? Ha! You mother of asterisk cur, and all of you. Turning a deaf ear to the high priest's curses, one of the archbishops in red looked at Tang In with resentment and shouted crazily, Do you think we don't know that you have the ability to teleport? What a joke! The Millennial Temple is not something you heretics can speculate about. Do you know that the temple has collected all the battle reports of you fighting with others? You are not a spatial magician at all, and you don't know any long-distance teleportation. With these people dragging you down, you can only teleport 10 kilometers away at most. And at that time, what awaits you will be the continuous pursuit of the temple's elite magicians. Ha ha! Tang In, oh Tang In, no matter how strong you are, how many people can you protect when the time comes? Amidst the crazed shouts, Tang Un's foot, which was about to step into the spatial passage, paused in midair. He was startled and looked at the emissary of the fallen, Meredith, who was still holding her great sword high in the sky, and then looked at the crazed archbishops in red. He seemed to have suddenly thought of something, and his expression turned thoughtful. A few of the royal high priests looked at each other when they heard this, but they could tell that there was an opportunity. They hurriedly said, That's not a problem. Your Excellency Tang In, as long as you agree to save the second prince, we will definitely risk our lives to ensure everyone's safety. We will definitely. Waving his hand to interrupt them, Tang In looked at Meredith in the sky again, and then looked at the archbishops with an extremely serious expression. He said, "Let me ask you a question. How long will it take for this thing that you have deliberately created, Meredith, to prepare for the attack?" 10 breaths will do, the archbishops replied subconsciously. Oh, enlightened, Tang In touched his nose. Then how long has it been since he raised his sword and shouted, "Nonsense!" The moment he paused, the archcardinal was stunned. The royal consecrators were stunned. Even Joshua and company were stunned when they heard this. Actually, from the moment Meredith raised her sword, Tang In felt that something was amiss. However, the situation was too dangerous, and escaping was more important, so he did not have the time to think about it. However, now that he received an answer from the archbishops, Tang In finally knew what was amiss. Time. That's right, time. The reason why a big move was a big move was because of its unparalleled destructive power. And to have such destructive power, it naturally needed time to prepare. For example, Wu Ding's Sword of Annihilation, or Bamata's 9-headed mutated beast, all of them needed time to prepare and could not be easily used immediately. Of course, this time would not be long. There would not be a situation where a big move was prepared for a long time, but the opponent had already run out of the damage range. For example, Meredith's 10 breaths sword move. In 10 breaths, if one did not use something similar to teleportation, no one could guarantee that they would run out of the sword's damage range. However, the actual situation now was that, from the moment Meredith raised her sword in the air, Tang In had opened a spatial passage, insta-killed a void-level powerhouse who was courting death, and chatted with the remaining royal consecrators for a while. Then, the archcardinal had drawn aggro for a while. During this time, Tang In did not feel the terrifying power of the collapse of heaven and earth after the big move was unleashed, so he was not in a hurry to leave. Now that he thought about it, the time spent on all this was definitely more than 10 breaths, right? But now, Meredith, who had raised her sword, was still raising it, with no intention of lowering it. What the F***CK was this? After a moment of silence, David scratched his head and guessed hesitantly, could it be? This fallen emissary suddenly has a conscience and doesn't want to kill us anymore. David, this idea of yours makes sense. Chapter 1064. Let's not talk about whether David's statement was reliable or not. Well, it would be a joke to say that it was reliable, but the fact was that the effect was very obvious. Everyone was petrified. To make an inappropriate analogy, this was like playing an online game in the modern world and clearing a dungeon. It was not easy to get to the last stage of the dungeon and face the final boss. This big boss was also very impressive. His origins were unfathomable, and his appearance was shocking to the extreme. His combat power was also off the charts. In the end, while they were trembling in fear, the big boss left behind a few harsh words and actually didn't say anything else. It ended just like that. Didn't you want to kill everyone in the world? Can't we King have fun together? Pull one hair and the whole body will be affected. In fact, Tang In and the others did not have to feel that it was ridiculous, because this was not the only blunder. Almost at the same time, there were some events that were far more ridiculous than what they were experiencing: the capital city of Bran, the palace castle under the drizzle. In the slightly gloomy and cold palace of the king, the heavy curtains swayed left and right with the cold wind that snuck in, bringing with it the pungent smell of medicine, as well as some indescribable undercurrents that were surging in. As the most powerful man on this continent, the old king of Bran was now really old. Lying on the hospital bed, his face was sallow, his body was thin, and his chest was slightly undulating. No matter how one looked at it, he looked like the king of beasts that was dying and would not live for long. However, compared to the miserable ending of dying beasts that could only die under the claws of other beasts, the old king of Bran was still relatively happy, even though he was old. Because until today, there was still no one who dared to attack him. And because the person standing by the bed holding a bowl of medicine was his direct descendant, the eldest prince. He was old and cared for, and his descendants were filial to him. Such a warm scene. Who could say that he was not happy? With a silent wave of his hand, the great prince dismissed the servants and attendants around him. He stood quietly by the bedside and silently looked at the old king, who was also his father, whose breathing was weak. His expression was constantly changing, unpredictable and complicated. Hesitation, struggle, resentment, pleasure. Just like the porcelain bowl in his hand, the medicinal concoction in the bowl trembled slightly, unable to calm down for a long time. After a long time, she took a deep breath, as if she had decided on something. She leaned forward and called out softly, Lord Father, it's time to take your medicine. Oh, it's you. Cough, cough. You've already taken care of a nation's affairs. Why do you have time to bring me medicine today? As he called out softly, the old king slowly opened his old, murky eyes. He looked at the first prince by his bedside, somewhat surprised. Then, with the support of the latter, he coughed and leaned against the head of the bed. It's been some time since I've heard Father's teachings, so I finished dealing with state affairs early today and came to see you. The first prince lowered his head and leaned over to tuck in the bedding as he explained. Yes. Hearing this, the old king nodded in satisfaction. He raised his hand and patted the first prince's arm, clearly very satisfied with his filial piety. Then he thought of something and slowly asked, It's been so many days. Has there been any progress in the negotiations between your brother and the Gray Coat Army? Now that the Empire is in danger, only by appeasing the Gray Coat Army will the Empire have the strength to spare to resist the invasion of the northern wilderness tribes. Cough, cough. You must keep this in mind when handling state affairs. Do well and cooperate with your brother. The throne of the Empire, huff. The throne will be yours in the end. Ha! Lord Father, you said this a few years ago. A few years later, you're still saying this. Lifting his head, the first prince held up the bowl of medicine and respectfully replied, Lord Father, don't worry. I understand. Yes, the medicine is getting cold. Lord Father, drink it while it's hot. Take care of your body is more important. Yes, right. How's the sword god's body now? If I have any medicine here that he can use, cough, cough, feel free to use it. The sword god is recovering, just like Father. Cough, cough. That's good. That's good. It was still the capital of the Bran, still the palace castle, outside the royal sanatorium. Junior, you didn't call me out for a walk, right? Or is it raining? If you have something to say, just say it. As they walked side by side in the drizzle, Sea Tower turned his head to look at Winslin, who was walking with his head lowered and seemed to be a little absent-minded. Master can't be short of people. Hurry up and finish your words so that I can go and take care of. Junior? Oh. Winslin paused and seemed to come back to his senses. He wiped the rain off his face and inadvertently turned his head to avoid Sea Tower's surprised gaze. It's like this. Didn't His Highness, the second prince, go to the north? I heard that his negotiations with the Gray Coat Army didn't go very well, so he sent someone to send a message back, hoping that Philip could go again. He relied on his personal relationship with the Gray Coat Army to deal with them and break the deadlock. Then let's go. Why? Philip doesn't want to go. Winslin nodded. It should be because of the negotiations last time. Those counselors left without his consent, which made him a little disheartened. I went to persuade him, but it didn't work. Philip only said that he missed that opportunity. The Gray Coat Army won't talk about favors during the formal negotiations, so he didn't want to make this trip in vain again. He paused and spread his hands at the speechless Sea Tower. So I want you to try persuading him again, Senior. Maybe he will agree. I don't have that ability. Passing through the arched door at the end of the road, Sea Tower smiled bitterly and shook his head. Then he couldn't help but frown in annoyance. These damn counselors, they only care about their own safety at this time. So I forget it. How about this? I'll go and try to find him now. Junior, you go back and take care of Master. Okay, I'll send you. My carriage is parked outside the castle. The coachman knows where Philip is now. He waved his hand. What's there to send? It's not like I don't know your carriage. It's more important for you to hurry back and take care of Master. After a pause, Sea Tower suddenly turned his head in confusion and looked around the empty square. That's strange. Where did the palace guards go? Maybe it's a temporary change of guard. Winston's expression froze. Then he looked around and replied casually. Is that so? Although he had doubts, Sea Tower didn't think too much about it. Winston, who was about to say goodbye, suddenly stopped in his tracks. His expression changed greatly. He suddenly raised his head. Who is it? Come out. Before he finished shouting, a mysterious runic magic circle appeared out of thin air above them. It covered their heads and instantly trapped Sea Tower and Winston, who were caught off guard. Then, the holy light of magic shot into the sky. Light magic, you dare rumble. In the bedroom, the old king had just put down the porcelain bowl. He frowned and hadn't completely dissolved the bitter medicine in his mouth. There was a loud explosion outside the house. He was stunned. Outside, there's thunder? It was drizzling outside. It wasn't surprising that there was thunder, but just as he finished speaking, there was another series of loud explosions. This time, there was a faint roar and the muffled sound of buildings collapsing. It obviously didn't sound like thunder. The old king was old, but he wasn't stupid. Or it could be said that even if he had Alzheimer's disease, he was at least clear-headed at this time. He was stunned again, and there was anger. What's going on? Is there someone who dares to make a move in the palace castle? Cough, cough. The eldest prince didn't answer. Or more accurately, he couldn't hear any sound at this time, including the thunder and the old king's questioning. His gaze was fixed on the empty porcelain bowl. He looked like he was crying and laughing at the same time. He was absent-minded and complicated. Guards, damn it. Where did those idiots go? He suddenly interrupted. Don't shout. No one will come. Taking a deep breath, the eldest prince raised his slightly bowed body. It was as if a heavy burden had been lifted. His back was straight and didn't bend at all. He lowered his head and looked at the old king with pity in his eyes. He said faintly, Father, there's only me and you here now. Then why are you still standing here? Hurry up and go. The old king's reclining body suddenly shook. He realized something and looked up in disbelief. He looked straight at the eldest prince, who was staring straight at him, as if he was looking at a stranger. You, he interrupted again. Father, do you want to know the source of these abnormal sounds? Haha, there's no need to investigate. I can tell you now. The corners of the first prince's mouth curled up slightly. This should be the sound of the light palace ambushing and killing the eldest disciple of the sword god, Mr. Haita. You don't have to worry. It won't take long for these sounds to disappear. What did you say? Cough, cough. They dare. The old king was shocked and furious. Of course they dare, and they will succeed easily, because they have been preparing for this for a long time, because they have a spy, and also because the eldest prince raised his chin proudly. They have the permission of the next king of the brand. You want a rebel? Hearing this, the old king knew what he meant. He was even more furious. The eldest prince seemed to have completely relaxed. He shook his finger. No, I don't want to. I have already done it, and I'm about to succeed. Ha! Don't be agitated, father. Agitation will make your blood flow faster, and it will make some of the things that were mixed in the medicine spread throughout your body faster. Before he finished speaking, the old king's face turned red. He suddenly stood up and spat out a mouthful of black blood. His face quickly turned gray. The eldest prince was startled. He wiped the blood on his sleeve and said helplessly, I told you not to be agitated, father. Cough, cough. Unfilial son, you will die a horrible death. The old king grabbed the eldest prince's arm as he stood up. His face was distorted as he scolded. Under the accumulated pressure, the first prince subconsciously retreated in fear. However, because his arm was grabbed, he threw himself back in front of the old king and struggled frantically. Let go. I am an unfilial son. You forced me to do this. It was unknown where the old king got his strength from. He was clearly in a dying state. However, the burly first prince was unable to pry open his withered, twig-like palm. I'm the eldest prince. I'm the first successor to the throne. I should have taken the throne long ago, but you old bastard kept trying to delay it. Let go of me. You just won't let go. Look, you just want to take the throne and not let go. You watched me and the hypocrite fight in secret. It was like watching two wild dogs fighting for a bone. Good. Didn't you want to see who's better? Now that we have separated, the hypocrite will not come back from the north. Let me tell you, he has already been destroyed by the attack of the temple. Ha! The ear-piercing and crazy laughter echoed in the hall. It even suppressed the roar from afar. There's no need for you to choose, and there's no need for you to fight with the hypocrite. You're dead, and he's dead. I'll naturally be the next king of the Bran Empire. You F. Astor's king, let go of me. He looked at the old king who was vomiting blood and could not speak. However, his hand still held on to his right arm. His eyes were as angry as a tiger's. The eldest prince panicked and was afraid. He reached out his left hand and grabbed the porcelain bowl at the head of the bed. Without thinking, he threw it at the old king's white-haired head. Let go, let go, let go. Bang, bang, bang. Blood splattered everywhere. Broken tiles flew everywhere. After a short while, everything returned to silence. Only the sound of heavy breathing echoed in the empty hall. Similar silence. In the square of the royal castle, it was drizzling, falling on the broken walls, the many knights of the divine palace, the mages, and the motionless sea tower in the middle of the crowd. Drip, drip. Lowering his head, he stared blankly at the familiar spear that pierced through his heart. Blood mixed with rain slowly dripped down the tip of the spear. At a certain moment, Haida was suddenly enlightened. He recalled the strange situation where there was not a single guard in such a large square. He recalled how his predecessor's descendant was obviously distracted. He recalled how he had found an excuse to take him away from the sanatorium and away from his master's side. Bang. He knelt down on one knee. The long hair in front of his forehead covered Sea Tower's face. Only a soft and gentle voice could be heard. Why? I'm sorry. Sea Tower did not turn his head. Naturally, he could not see Winselin's panicked expression behind him. He subconsciously let go of the spear in his hand and stepped back. I didn't want to, brother, I really didn't want to. You have to forgive me. You have to forgive me. The blood flowed faster and instantly dyed the bluestone floor under Sea Tower red. After a few heavy breaths, Sea Tower suddenly shouted, I ask you, Huff, why? What? Is it? Why? Because I have no choice. I really have no choice. Brother, you are too close to the second prince. The first prince found my family, and the temple also found my family. Master is now like this. Brother, what do you want me to do? Tell me what to do. Winselin, who was grabbing his hair like a madman, kept stepping back. A temple knight on the side frowned and stepped forward. He wanted to kill the dying Sea Tower with his sword and end the siege. But before he got close, he was stunned. I see. Ha ha ha. Shaking his head and laughing, Sea Tower, who was kneeling on one knee, suddenly gasped for breath. He raised his hand to grab the spear tip and slowly pulled it out of his body. Inch by inch, blood splattered everywhere. Winselin, you are really... Mud can't help a wall. With a faint, regretful voice, he waved the spear. Pure green fighting light suddenly burst out from his broken body. It was like a river overflowing a dam, instantly sweeping the whole place. Not good. Back, boom, boom, boom. Chapter 1065. Pull one hair and the whole body will be affected. This wasn't just a saying. With the appearance of the emissary of depravity Meredith, as well as the complacent confessions of the few archbishops who boasted that they had victory in their hands, a tragic picture of the struggle for imperial power, the infighting of fathers and sons, the killing of brothers, and so on, slowly unfurled. This was a big picture and also a trap within a trap. The Temple of Light played the main role of the mastermind and the go-between. First, the elite mages of the Temple of Light were transferred from thousands of miles away. Then, they spent a lot of effort to set up a small teleportation formation and generously took out the ancient formation. All of these were for the sake of using a big move to completely annihilate the upper echelons of the Grey Coat Army and the Second Prince's group. Killing the higher-ups of the Grey Coat Army had achieved a similar effect as the negotiations. Without a leader, the new Grey Coat Army naturally could not participate in the negotiations. What followed was an all-out war between the Bran Empire and the Northern Wilderness tribes. Killing the Second Prince's group and framing the Grey Coat Army was just a small part of the plan. The main goal was to pave the way for everything that was happening in the palace's castle. The logic behind this was just as the first prince had said. The old king was dead, and so was the second prince. It went without saying who would take the throne. Come to think of it, if the Temple of Light had not secretly reached an agreement with the first prince and reaped enough benefits, they would not have spared no expense to contribute their manpower and resources, jumping up and down all over the place. There was no doubt that in the end, the biggest winner of this scheme was the Divine Hall. Such deliberate planning could be said to be exhausting. However, this was where the saying went, "Man proposes, God disposes." The royal palace had set up a backup plan with great fanfare and had almost completed all the initial steps in one go. But who would have thought that this plan would have such a huge flaw from the very beginning? The emissary of depravity Meredith's heavy sword, which was supposed to be her opening move, was unable to descend. What a mess! As the saying goes, a good start is half the battle. Now that he had made a mistake in the beginning, even if he succeeded in the end, there would be many drawbacks. This was similar to the principle of building a tall building. If the foundation was not well laid, then no matter how beautiful the building was, it would be difficult to hide the hidden dangers. However, if one wanted to know the root cause of this flaw, it would be simple to sum it up in a single sentence. It was hard to guard against a thief at home. Southeast of Red Maple Town, about 30 kilometers away, in the belly of an inconspicuous hill. Block it, damn it! Don't let them get close to the array. You still dare to appear? How dare you take the initiative to cause trouble for us, Sylvia? You're courting death. They were indeed in the middle of the cave. More than half of the hill should have been hollowed out to accommodate the dozens of robed mages and nearly 100 knights of light in standard armor. Oh, other than that, there were also two profound formations, one big and one small. The smaller ones looked more common, similar to the long-distance teleportation arrays in the spatial towers of some hubs of major cities. The other large formation was even stranger. It was emitting wisps of black chi, clearly not a good thing. Well, let's not talk about what it was for the time being. Seeing so many mages and knights gathered together and chose to hide in this dark cave, it was obvious that they did not want to be disturbed. But unfortunately, just by listening to the roars and roars, as well as the continuous clashing of weapons, screams, and other lively movements, it was obvious that their plan to hide was in vain. In fact, it was exactly so. In the slightly crowded cave, a group of uninvited guests who obviously came with ill intentions formed the most powerful arrow formation under the leadership of an abnormally fat woman. They did not reply, nor did they shout. They just waved their spears and kept attacking the two profound formations in the depths of the cave. Wherever the arrow formation was pointed, for a moment, the people in charge were invincible. In fact, from the scene, there was a clear gap between the two sides in terms of numbers and combat power. As the owner of this cave, there were long-range mages, close-range knights of light, and even a few healing priests on the periphery. The combat configuration was excellent and complete, but it should be because they were caught off guard. It was also because the woman who led the charge was really fierce. Her spear was like a dragon, sweeping, smashing, and slashing. The situation was completely reversed because of this. No matter how one looked at it, the ambushers had no advantage at all. Yet, despite facing enemies several times their size, their momentum was not reduced at all. Instead, they had the upper hand. This scene undoubtedly caused the owner of this place to be both shocked and angry. The owner of this place was a skinny old man standing beside the mysterious formation. His face was flushed red with anger, and it seemed that the color of his face was even brighter than the red robe he was wearing. It was exceptionally splendid. It was not only because of the sudden appearance of the other party that interrupted the critical moment of the arrow on the bow. It was also because of the identity of the other party. The red-robed old man almost didn't need to think about it to be sure that the reason why the other party appeared here must be because they were informed by the insiders of the temple. Wasn't it hard to guard against a thief in the house? Just as he was vexed, the mysterious array, surrounded by dozens of great magicians behind him, suddenly emitted a pitch-black brilliance. The hexagonal array flickered indeterminately, and waves of pressure expanded and contracted like a tide, constantly emitting a dangerous aura, causing people to feel a great sense of fear. However, right when the pitch-black brilliance gathered at the center of the six-pointed star array and formed a pitch-black pillar of air that was about to soar into the sky, a shout suddenly sounded out, and a holy and domineering spear light instantly pierced through the chaotic battlefield and numerous figures in the field. Amidst exclamations and furious roars, it accurately smashed into the pitch-black pillar. The cave shook and the ground trembled. It was like a strong earthquake, and the inner walls of the cave rustled down. The holy spear light, the dark pillar of chi, one white and one black. Even ordinary people could see that these were two extremes. Now that they were entangled together, naturally water and fire could not coexist. They violently collided with each other, causing waves of chi. It was like a strong wind passing through the field, rolling over the heads of everyone in the field. After all, the dark pillar of chi was formed by dozens of great mages. Its power was really amazing. With just a simple contact, it ruthlessly crushed the incoming domineering spear light. However, the thin old man in the big red robe was furious again when he saw this. He roared angrily, "Good, good, good. Sylvia, since you are sincerely looking for death, then don't blame me for not considering our past friendship." It was no wonder that the old man in the red robe was so angry. It turned out that after the domineering spear light was crushed, the dark pillar of chi seemed to be affected as well. It once again scattered into dark brilliance and shrank back into the mysterious array. It was obvious that all the preparation just now had been for naught. And looking at the situation, it was obvious that this was not the first time this domineering spear light had done this. In this way, how could the old man in the red robe not be anxious? He waved his hand fiercely. Except for operating the ancient transmission array, the rest of you attack with all your strength. Kill this crazy woman first. As soon as the roar fell, the situation suddenly reversed. After all, there's a great disparity between the strong and the weak. Moreover, these knights and mages were obviously not ordinary people. Previously, they should be concerned about the array and multitasking, so it was inevitable that they were afraid. Now that they obeyed the order to focus fire and attack with all their strength, the attackers were outnumbered and naturally could not gain the slightest advantage. Even the crazy woman who had been steadily charging forward, Anne, Sylvia, could not help but purse her lips in the face of all kinds of magic that came from the sky above her head. She withdrew her spear and turned from attack to defense. With her defense, the dozens of people behind her naturally had to stop in their tracks. Then, in a short breath, under the attacks of all kinds of magic and the continuous attacks of the temple knights, the arrow formation was like a candle in the wind, flickering and about to be extinguished. The principle of fighting with one drum, weakening with the second, and exhausting with the third was applicable everywhere, especially in a battle. Sylvia led a few dozen people, but she was able to withstand the pressure several times that of her own and break through the hinterland of the cave. It could be said that it was a miracle. Apart from his superior strength, the most important reason was the previous surprise attack. He had unreasonably forced his way in and completely messed up the battle in the cave at the first moment. This was the so-called fighting with one drum. Now, under the command of the red-robed old man, the people of the Temple of Light came back to their senses and began to fight back with all their strength. The difference in strength between the two sides was thus exposed, and the momentum of Sylvia's attack was inevitably weakened. Therefore, one could foresee that, if there were no accidents later, Sylvia's lone army that suddenly broke into the cave was destined to be annihilated. And, at least in the eyes of the red-robed old man, this was the right outcome. Therefore, After seeing that the situation on the scene had stabilized a little, the red-robed old man's expression relaxed slightly. He snorted coldly and turned his head to the dozens of mages who were surrounding the large-scale, mysterious array behind him and made a gesture to continue. The mages nodded slightly, raised their magic staffs again, and instilled the magic around them into the array in front of them. In the next moment, the pitch-black brilliance flashed again. Chapter 1066. She moved, the emissary moved, all right, the camera panned all over the place. Finally, let's return to the starting point, Red Maple Town. It's worth mentioning that whether it was the chaos in the palace south of Bran or the surprise attack in the cave 30 kilometers away, they all happened at the same time after Meredith, the emissary of the Fallen, appeared. In other words, even though there was a lot of ink, there was a lot of fighting everywhere. In fact, not much time had passed. After Tang In pointed out Meredith's abnormality, everyone was stunned for a moment. When they came back to their senses, they each pondered the reason and considered if they should take advantage of this opportunity to quickly evacuate the town. In the cave 30 kilometers away, the dozens of temple mages who were undisturbed once again activated the mysterious array, and the hexagram array appeared again. The current movement was the emissary of the Fallen, Meredith, who had been stunned for a while, finally moved again. The pressure came again. One left and one right, one black and one white. The two wings on Meredith's side flapped slightly, her long hair flew, and the weather changed. All kinds of energy elements that covered the sky and earth gathered from all directions at a speed visible to the naked eye. They condensed on the heavy sword raised high, shining brightly. Of course, the so-called changing of the weather, darkness, and so on were just environmental anomalies that ordinary people could see. They were also just appearances. In the eyes of masters like Tang In, the meaning of these anomalies was undeniably terrifying. First of all, this was not a spontaneous gathering, but a forceful taking. The two huge black and white wings that spread out for an unknown distance gently flapped, and not only a single combat energy element or magic element was swept over. Instead, all the energy elements drifting in this area were swept up in one fell swoop and domineeringly collected. Secondly, as long as it was forcefully taken over, no matter what element it was, it would eventually be divided into black and white auras with Meredith's towering body as the boundary between the left and the right, fusing for her own use. Not to mention other things, just this method of turning the sky and earth upside down and reversing yin and yang was amazing. At least the royal consecrators below were completely dumbfounded when they saw this. If they asked themselves honestly, they would definitely not be able to do such a thing. In fact, they did not even dare to think about it. The reason was simple. They were battle-chi warriors, so naturally, they couldn't absorb magic elements. But then again, if they could absorb magic elements, they wouldn't be battle aura warriors. In a word, it was a contradiction. A spear was a spear, and a shield was a shield. Of course, it was impossible for two completely different things to be put together. Just like the scene in the cave not long ago, Sylvia's pure and holy spear light and the dark pillar condensed from the mysterious array, the two of them had only touched for a moment before they violently collided. There was no need for the magicians to command the dark pillar to shatter the holy spear light. How could they coexist with different attributes? How can one fall in love with a different gender? Cough, cough. Well, this was the so-called gap. In the eyes of the imperial family's consecrators, this was something that was impossible and unimaginable. But in the hands of Meredith, the emissary of the Fallen, it was as natural as eating and drinking. Furthermore, not only did he show off his heaven-defying ability to instantly transform the elements of power, he even toyed with the two incompatible forces in his hands. What a pervert. But in the eyes of the cardinals, this perverted move was truly good news. Their faces were bursting with joy as they looked at Meredith, not as if they were looking at the emissary of the Fallen, but as if they were looking at the Father God, waving their arms and shouting in surprise. He moved, the emissary moved, It had to be said that this mentality could be called perverted. When Meredith's heavy sword slashed down, it didn't just kill bystanders. They were also in the range of the attack. But now, no one was in the mood to complain about this strange scene. The imperial family's consecrators looked up at the increasingly terrifying black and white heavy sword, their minds blank, and they couldn't help but despair. It's over. In the face of danger, some people were ecstatic, and some were truly desperate. And some, well, they were ready to run. Tangen's eyesight was very good. Although he couldn't figure out the reason for Meredith's previous crash, he was already prepared and ran faster than anyone else when the other party was obviously going to flip out. He pulled and kicked Josiah, Fry, little Carol, David, and the other members of the gray space who were holding hands and stuffed them into the spatial passage. As for himself, he was the last to leave because he had to guard against the charlatans and the imperial family's consecrators, or because they had the dirty mentality of dragging others down with them. But this worry was obviously unnecessary. Now, whether it was the crazy charlatans or the despairing imperial family's consecrators, none of them had the intention to attack them. They were either laughing ear-piercingly or staring blankly at the sky, hopelessly waiting for the arrival of destruction. Although they looked very pitiful, Tangen's heart didn't waver in the slightest. In fact, there was still time to save a few more people. At least the second prince, who was unconscious on the ground not far away, could be casually thrown into the spatial passage, but Tangen didn't have any thoughts of saving him. What kind of joke was this? He wasn't a saint. It was fine as long as he could save Josiah and the others. As for the others, sorry, they could do whatever they wanted with this mentality. When Tangen stepped into the spatial passage, he didn't look at the second prince at the side, nor did he look at the high-ranking officers of the Greycoat army below. Instead, he subconsciously narrowed his eyes and looked up at Meredith in the air, as well as the heavy sword that looked like it was going to collapse and collapse the peak like thunder. You're here? Well, bye. I'm leaving. The light shone brightly, and the clouds moved in all directions. The speed at which the dual-colored sword fell wasn't fast, but of course, it wasn't slow either. It was also this moderate speed that allowed the people below to see every horrifying detail with their own eyes. On the left side of their line of sight, there was a dark brilliance that was as thick as ink, deep and bottomless. It spread wantonly, sweeping away the rows of clouds that bordered it. It was as if a new world had been built, a world that was at the bottom of the abyss of hell, causing people to lose all hope and despair. On the right side of their line of sight, there was a pure white light that was so holy that it was dazzling. It seemed to warm people's hearts, but in fact, it immediately distorted space and shattered the flowing clouds. Without destruction, there would be no construction. After destruction, construction would also create a new world. In this world, other than the monotonous and boring white scenery, there was nothing else. With the combination of the two, in the eyes of the people below, it was this sword that slashed down, splitting the entire sky into two, splitting it into two different worlds. And as the boundary between the two different worlds, right below the enormous and terrifying sword that fell from the sky, was Red Maple Town. Before the sword reached them, the people below held their breaths. Their blank expressions gradually turned red in pain, and the veins on their necks bulged. It seemed that under the power of this sword, the omnipresent air had chosen to dodge, hurriedly leaving the area covered by the sword momentum, directly pushing this place into a vacuum state. And under this terrifying power that could destroy heaven and earth and make all things retreat, a trembling and very confused question sounded. Boss, aren't we leaving? The space channel was not a city gate, and it was not so easy to enter and exit. If there was no relevant person to lead them, even if they hid in the space channel, they would definitely be involved in the space turbulence, and they would not be able to come out until they died. Therefore, Josiah and the others who hid in the space channel first did not immediately leave this dangerous place. Instead, they held hands and floated beside the channel door for fear of being lost and separated. In other words, Ting In who was supposed to lead them to leave by teleportation, did not enter the space. And that was the truth. The second last person to enter the space channel was David. His hand was still holding Tang In's hand. He turned his head in surprise, only to see that Tang In had 1 foot in the channel and 1 foot outside the space. He was looking up at something in a daze, motionless, with a puzzled expression. He did not seem to want to leave at all. He muttered to himself, "It seems to be off." What? David was in the channel, so he naturally did not know what Tang In saw and what he was asking. Tang In blinked, and then blinked again, and then narrowed his long and narrow eyes. His expression was very complicated and strange at this time. He seemed to be sure of something, but he did not dare to believe his own judgment. He scratched his head and subconsciously replied, "This sword seems, to be off target." David's eyes suddenly widened, and his mouth formed a funny O shape. He opened and closed several times and swallowed with difficulty. It was unknown whether he was crying or laughing. "No, it can't be," without an answer. Tang In simply withdrew his gaze and looked at the few Imperial consecrators not far away. At this time, the sword light was very close to the ground, not far above their heads. But there was no panic or despair on the latter's face. Instead, like Tang In, there was confusion, disbelief, and a little uncontrollable ecstasy. They looked at each other and paused. "Off target? It seems to be a little off target. Is it off target or not?" Off target? It had to be said that this scene was really ridiculous. The few people present, whether it was Tang In or the Imperial consecrators who had the strength of void level, which one of them was not a master who had sharp eyes and experienced hundreds of battles. But now, these masters who seemed to be high and mighty in the eyes of ordinary people were not even confident in their judgment of the vertical falling point of such a huge sword light that could be seen as long as one was not blind. Or more accurately, they all judged it, but no one dared to believe their own judgment. Happiness came too suddenly, and they could not accept it at all, right? Originally, such a legendary figure, such a shocking prelude to his move, such a world-shattering might, such. "You King said that you missed your target? You say wrong, right or wrong?" However, they did not dare to be sure. But the falling sword light was annoyed and directly gave an accurate answer. Over everyone's head, over the town's range, and then it fell into the large red maple forest south of the town. The next moment, boom, boom. Chapter 1067. Jokes were jokes, and unscientific was unscientific. In fact, rather than saying that everyone did not dare to believe their own judgment, it was better to say that they did not dare to believe that Meredith would fail and make such a mistake. These two statements seem to be similar, but in fact, there was a big difference. At least from the fact that Tang In would rather stay where he was and not immediately teleport away with Josiah and the others. It could be seen that although he sounded uncertain on the surface, he was actually very certain of his judgment in his heart. That was the truth. In the instant that the sword light slashed down, Tang In sensed that the sword seemed to have deviated by a bit. Don't underestimate this difference. The distance between Meredith in the air and the small town on the ground was more than 10,000 feet. With such a large distance, even if it was only a slight deviation at the beginning, when it actually landed on the ground, it would be at least a few miles of difference. This was the so-called difference of a hair, 1,000 miles of difference. Of course, the above was only Tang In's personal judgment. The actual situation could only be concluded after the dust had settled. Facts always spoke louder than words. So, when the sword light fell, the truth came, boom, boom, boom. In an instant, a strange semicircle formed by black and white light appeared on the ground, spinning and spreading. In a short breath, it was like a ferocious beast opening its bloody mouth, instantly swallowing the surrounding area and swallowing large tracts of maple forest. Countless fallen maple leaves that were as red as blood danced in the air. They were like birds that had been frightened out of their wits as they fled in panic. But they only flashed for a moment before being dragged into the strange semicircle, torn into ashes, and disappeared in the blink of an eye. This kind of terrifying power was truly in the category of cutting the sky and splitting the earth. It was like the end of the world, and mortals could only walk the path of death. Fortunately, the sword light fell in the red maple forest on the south side of the town, so it naturally could not hurt Tang and the others who were at the center of the town. But not being hurt did not mean that there was no effect at all. In fact, when the thunderous explosion came out, the earth trembled, and a large number of buildings in the already dilapidated town collapsed in an instant. Especially the southern area of the town near the explosion site. At a glance, there was a flat road, and almost no intact walls could be seen. Ruins were everywhere, and the mess was unbearable to look at. Fortunately, when the pressure descended, most of the town's residents had evacuated the buildings and gathered in the streets, squares, and other open spaces. Therefore, although there were constant cries of alarm, there were not many casualties, which could be considered a blessing in disguise. When the trembling on the ground slowed down, it was replaced by rolling waves of air. Most of them soared into the sky and roared towards the boundless sky, displaying their tyrannical might. Under the pressure, a small amount of airwaves rolled and overflowed in all directions, instantly swallowing the surrounding red maple forest like a whale. At the same time, it also swept across the sky above the town. Boom, boom, boom. Now, the townspeople didn't have to be envious of each other or blame each other, because all the buildings and houses had collapsed, including the hurried construction of the Maluan negotiation venue. You mother-f***er. You're worried that we're not dead enough. After confirming that the sword light had missed its target, Tang immediately pulled David and the others out of the spatial tunnel. After all, this thing was not an all-purpose shelter. As long as the external force was stronger, such as the residual power of the sword move, it would be enough to distort and collapse the spatial tunnel. As soon as David and the others walked out of the spatial tunnel, what they saw was such a shocking scene. It was as if an earth dragon had turned over. They opened their mouths and were stunned speechless for a moment. When they thought about the tragic consequences if the sword light had not missed its target, they were even more terrified. Harry swallowed hard and subconsciously replied with a trembling voice, "How can it be completely destroyed? If we're hit by it, not to mention bones, I'm afraid even bones and ashes will be gone." Hearing this, everyone nodded in agreement. In fact, if the sword light had not missed, not to mention the people, even the entire red maple town under their feet would have been completely wiped out and become history. Fortunately, just like there was no medicine for regret, there were not so many ifs in this world. If the sword light had missed its target, it had missed its target. The sword move came quickly and left quickly. Although the strange black and white semicircle was still spreading and terrifying and unstoppable, the expansion slowed down. After a simple calculation, it was obvious that it could not cover the town. Tang looked up again. After Meredith slashed down with her sword, she did not show any signs of raising her sword to attack again. Instead, the towering giant's body quickly faded, revealing the bleak sky behind it. A moment later, a cold wind blew. The strange black and white semicircle, the emissary of the fallen Meredith, as well as the terrifying pressure that made people breathless from before, all disappeared, as if they had never appeared. Of course, the dead leave their names, and the passing of wild geese leave their voices. Although these things had disappeared, the traces were still there. Not to mention the ruins that he couldn't bear to gamble on, nor did he look at the townspeople who were crying in grief after losing their homes. The people who could still stand silently found a place to stand and looked to the south of the town. They saw the town's characteristic, the large expanse of red maple forest, had completely disappeared, and not even a trace of leaves could be seen. Instead, there was a 90-degree ravine that looked like it had been carved by a sword and an axe. In other words, the town that was originally located in the wilderness had now reached the edge of the cliff and became a standard place of great danger. Because of the angle, the people here could not see the full depth of the ravine. However, based on the previous large movement and simple speculation. They knew that it was definitely a bottomless abyss. And even if they could not know the depth, just from the surface of the ravine that seemed to be endless, at least more than 10 miles long and wide, they could see the supreme and terrifying power of the sword light from before. It must be known that the entire area of Red Maple Town was only about 10 square miles. In other words, once the sword light hit the ground, the endless ravine in front of them, which was the current state of the town, Light Divine Hall. Pausing after each word, a royal consecrator saw the situation and felt a lingering fear. He gritted his teeth and said, "I will remember this great hatred when we go back." Go back? Can we still go back? Cough, cough. I'm fine. You guys go and see how the knights are doing. The second prince, who had fainted earlier, had been rescued. He was covered in dust and kept coughing, but it seemed that there was not much of a problem. After getting up, he waved his hand and pushed away the royal consecrator who was supporting him. He even had the time to care about the members of the noble negotiation team who had collapsed on the ground not far away. This also reminded Tang and Josiah and the rest to quickly walk down the ruins and check on the high-ranking officers of the Gray Coat Army who had also fainted. "Sorry, Your Excellency Tang In, Miss Josiah, this incident." After a pause, the second prince, who was walking over, sighed and bowed. "It's my fault. I didn't know how to judge people properly and caused everyone to suffer such a disaster." Hearing this, Tang In and Josiah looked at each other, then looked at the gloomy and depressed second prince. For a moment, they did not know what to say. From the words of the red-cloaked archbishops, they knew that this incident could not be blamed on the second prince. It was the result of a deliberate plan by the Temple of Light. Of course, it was impossible to say that the second prince did not have any responsibility at all. After all, they were the ones who brought him here. Although it was unintentional, they had indeed become his accomplices without knowing it. But now, Tang In and Josiah really could not blame and reprimand him. Because according to the conversation between the second prince and the red-cloaked archbishops, the second prince in front of them was really a pitiful person. Not only was he secretly schemed against by the Temple of Light, it seemed that he was also involved in the struggle for imperial power and the tragic experience of brothers killing each other. This should also be the real meaning behind the second prince's words. "Can we still go back?" After hesitating for a while, Josiah coughed softly and replied, "Ahem, Your Highness the second prince, you are too serious. You did not know about this matter. It was the Temple of Light. Miss Josiah, you don't need to comfort me." Waving his hand to interrupt, the second prince took a deep breath and said, "Regardless of whether I knew about this matter or not, the fault lies with the Empire. Yes, but don't worry. The agreement between us is still valid. The relevant funds have already been transferred and will still be handed over to the Gray Coat Army." Josiah was stunned. Looking at the second prince's serious expression, he could not help but be speechless. Twain, who was standing at the side, was also slightly taken aback when he heard this. He then nodded slightly and looked at the second prince with admiration. Putting aside their standpoints, the second prince was definitely a material for great things. His methods and mentality were all extraordinary. It must be known that this was no longer the past. To put it bluntly, whether the second prince's honorable status was still, there was a problem. To put it bluntly, with the second prince's awkward status and the territory he was in, it was reasonable for the Gray Coat Army to take care of him. However, it was in such a precarious situation that the second prince's first thought was to fulfill the agreement and keep his promise. Other things aside, just looking at the big picture showed that he was an extremely intelligent person. This action not only took the overall situation of the Empire into consideration, but also stabilized the Gray Coat Army and prevented them from attacking the south of the Brand for revenge. He also took the opportunity to build a good relationship with the Gray Coat Army and establish a friendship that had gone through thick and thin together, leaving himself a way out. He believed that after this matter, even if the second prince returned to the south and the situation was not good for the throne of the Empire, the Gray Coat Army would be too embarrassed to loot a burning house. At least, they would not attack the second prince now. How could he not praise such a smart move that killed two birds with one stone? Of course, Josiah had no reason to reject it. After all, it was meat that was already in his mouth. Naturally, he would not give up so easily. On one side, he was interested, and on the other side, he was grateful. In the end, it was natural that they hit it off. After settling this matter, the second prince naturally would not stay in this troublesome place for too long. However, just as he was about to take his leave, he caught sight of a few archbishops who were slumped on the ground in a daze from the corner of his eye. His eyes flashed, and he paused for a moment before pointing at the latter and saying, "Miss Josiah, how about leaving these people to me? Well, I need to get some information from them." Of course, this was not a problem. After all, no matter who got their hands on them, their fates were destined. However, before Josiah could nod in agreement, Ting In, who was beside her, took over the conversation and said, "Just as well. I also want to know the reason why the fallen emissary failed just now, and where are the positions of those elite mages from the temple. Well, why don't we go and ask them together? Haha, I'm pretty good at extorting confessions." The second prince was stunned when he heard this. Then he chuckled and said, "Then I'll have to trouble your excellency, Tang In. It's no trouble at all. This is a good thing that can't be found even if you use the illuminating crystal." Chapter 1068. Now that she had taken advantage of the situation and picked up the loose ends, it was time to trace the cause back to the source. Whether it was Tang In's side, the second prince's side, or the few archbishops who were destined for tragedy, they all wanted to know the reason why Meredith, who was so powerful, had made such a mistake 30 kilometers away, in the middle of a cave. Sylvia, it was still the same thin old man in the red robe, his face still red. But compared to the simple, angry roar from before, there was a hint of shock and panic in his tone. He turned his head stiffly and looked at the completely destroyed, mysterious array, as well as the dozens of temple mages who stood dumbfounded at the side. He raised a trembling finger and pointed at Sylvia, who was sweeping in all directions, his body trembling. After a while, he choked out his grief and indignation. "Void level, you tricked me." It was no wonder that the thin old man was so agitated and resentful. The truth was more or less the same. He had indeed been tricked by Sylvia. As for the process, it was simple. It was at the moment when the ancient mysterious array was activated that Sylvia, who was surrounded by the temple mages and seemed to only have the power to defend herself and had no possibility of counterattacking, suddenly erupted with a terrifying power that was obviously much stronger than before. She suppressed the temple mages who were caught off guard and broke out of the encirclement. Her spear hit the mysterious runes of the array, directly taking the firewood from under the cauldron and completely destroying the base of the ancient array. Of course, the thin old man did not care whether the array was destroyed or not. What he cared about was whether or not Xiao Wei'an's spear had affected the power transmitted by the array. Well, this actually couldn't be considered a problem. The thin old man did not believe that it had not been affected. Just thinking about Sylvia's familiarity with the temple mages and her understanding of the secret spells of light, he knew that her deliberate spear should have been a sure thing. This was even more infuriating. No, with her superior power, Sylvia once again faced the encirclement much more easily. Unlike her previous charging posture, she even had the leisure to casually shrug and reply, "My power has always been like this. You are not on guard. Who can you blame? Impossible. You were clearly at the peak of the Earth realm before this." The skinny elder was about to go crazy, or at least, he was about to go crazy. However, he was right. Sylvia was a member of the Divine Hall and a martial arts genius that was hard to come by in 100 years. In this way, everyone in the temple was aware of her strength. She was at the peak of the Earth grade. But the strength she had just displayed and the way she dealt with the encirclement so easily, it was obvious that she was in the void realm. "Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot to mention it." Sylvia casually glanced at him and replied faintly, "A few months ago, I just broke through to the early stage of void stage. Ah, really at the void level? The skinny old man couldn't help but be shocked and angry when he heard this. But he was also filled with helplessness and resentment. A few months ago, Sylvia had decided to betray the Divine Hall and establish the new stream. At that time, both sides were already enemies, so Sylvia naturally couldn't tell them her true strength. In other words, they had hit the muzzle of a gun this time. It was pure bad luck. As for resentment, it was the skinny old man's resentment towards the intelligence agency of the Divine Hall. They had been besieging her for a few months, but they didn't get any information about Sylvia's breakthrough. Wasn't it obvious that they were cheating them? Of course, the real reason was not just that. Speaking of which, this really couldn't be blamed on the intelligence agency of the Divine Hall, because Sylvia broke through to the Void Realm. That was the result of an epiphany in the small hotel after she was rescued by Tang Yin. After returning to the north, the newly established New Stream was repeatedly besieged by the Divine Hall and had to flee everywhere. Their situation was almost the same as the Grey Coat Army a few years ago. But during this period, Sylvia rarely fought with others. She didn't fight if she could, and she rarely showed up. When she went out, she took a carriage. How could the intelligence agency of the Divine Hall detect this? As for the reason, the skinny old man now also saw it. In the field, Sylvia repeatedly waved her spear and led more than 10 wounded subordinates to fight and retreat. Finally, they retreated to the entrance of the cave. With one spear in hand, 10,000 enemies couldn't get through. The space was slightly open because of this. Only then did the skinny old man notice Sylvia's bloated body and her protruding lower abdomen. His eyes widened, and he instantly gasped and exclaimed, You, pregnant? Sylvia's previous intrusion was too sudden. It was like a blitzkrieg, and as soon as she came in, she rushed into the crowd and killed everyone. In the intense battle, not only the skinny old man, but also the people of the Divine Hall besieging her didn't notice the abnormality of her body. Only when the distance was slightly opened, everyone noticed her obviously bloated lower abdomen. What this meant was self-evident. It was a bolt from the blue. The magicians and knights of light of the Divine Hall were stunned and even forgot to attack. The cave, which was still full of fierce fighting a moment ago, was strangely silent at this moment. It was so quiet that you could hear a pin drop. Xiao Weian, on the other hand, was quite calm. She only lowered her hand and stroked her lower abdomen when countless gazes were focused on her. Then, she turned her head and calmly ordered the dozen or so knights who were covered with wounds behind her. You guys retreat first. My lady, retreat. Sylvia turned her head and lowered her eyes. She propped her spear on the ground and didn't look at the anxious subordinates who came forward to dissuade her. She said lightly but insistently, This is my personal action. I shouldn't have involved you. Retreat. Don't let my previous efforts go to waste. After a pause, she continued, Owen should be here. He shouldn't be far from here. You all go and meet him. By the way, pass me a message. Well, let him pass it to someone. This time I saved him. Now it's his turn to save me. His voice was faint, but it was filled with righteousness. Of course, Sylvia also had the confidence to be righteous. In the current situation, Sylvia was very clear that it was impossible for her to escape the pursuit of the temple. The temple wouldn't let her go. Her physical condition didn't allow her to run for long distances. Thus, she didn't have many choices left, of course. She could choose to commit suicide. If Sylvia was in a normal state, she wouldn't be able to accept the humiliation of being captured. She would definitely choose to commit suicide without hesitation, and it would be the most ruthless and vigorous kind. She wouldn't let the other party have the slightest chance to defile her body after death. But now, Sylvia gently stroked her lower abdomen. The corner of her mouth rose. The little guy hadn't opened his eyes to see the color of the sky and hadn't breathed the air of the world. How could she bear to commit suicide? Since she couldn't commit suicide and there was no possibility of running away, the only thing left was to accept the fate of being captured and waiting for rescue. Sylvia was calm about this. This should be the ending she had thought of when she came. There was nothing to be embarrassed about. Originally, I came thousands of miles to save you. Then, how could you not save me? How could you not save your unborn child? Of course, so she was generous. Since she had said so, there was no need to be pretentious anymore. After silently bowing to Sylvia's back, more than 10 new church knights silently withdrew from the cave. As for the people of the temple, they were still shocked by the fact that Sylvia was pregnant. Naturally, they couldn't run out to chase after them. After a while, when the new church knights were far away, Sylvia pursed her lips and walked into the cave confidently. With a swoosh, Sylvia moved and took a step forward. The people of the temple who were closest to her subconsciously took a big step back and raised their spears to block in front of them. Don't be agitated. Don't be afraid. Pressing her palm down, Xiao Weian calmly glanced at the dozens of knights in front of her. In the end, she fixed her eyes on the face of a young knight. Frowning, she thought for a while and said, "Edwin. Is it Edwin? Take it." She raised her hand and threw the flame spear across the air. "Yes, knight leader." The young knight, named Edwin, subconsciously stepped forward and raised his hand to catch the spear that was thrown at him. He was about to salute when he heard that. However, he reacted in an instant and froze on the spot. Holding the flame spear, he was speechless. "Huh!" With a chuckle, Sylvia raised her hand and patted the young knight's shoulder. She didn't say anything and continued to walk into the cave. It was as if a sword had cut open a lake. Wherever Sylvia walked, the people of the temple in front of her would move to the left and right and silently make way for her. It didn't look like they were escorting an enemy, but more like they were solemnly welcoming the arrival of a big shot. She calmly walked all the way to the deepest part of the cave and stopped in front of the skinny old man. At this time, several knights of light finally reacted and stepped forward to guard the skinny old man. In the end, Xiao Weian didn't come for the thin old man. She took a small step and bypassed them. Under everyone's watchful eyes, she safely stepped into the small teleportation array before stopping. She turned around and glanced around. "Aren't you leaving?" Everyone looked at each other and was speechless. At this time, the skinny old man finally came back to his senses. He looked at Sylvia's bulging belly with a complicated expression. He retracted his gaze and took a breath. "Are you surrendering?" "What else?" Sylvia spread out her hands and smiled. "Don't blame me for not reminding you. Your plan has failed, and revenge will come soon. If you don't leave now, you won't be able to leave later." The skinny old man's eyes twitched. "At that time, you will die in front of us, including the fetus in your belly. That's why I said we have the same goal." Xiao Weian shrugged. "Don't tell me you really want to stay here and fight me to the death?" The skinny old man was silent. That was the reason. Now that their plan had failed, if they didn't activate the transmission array in time, they wouldn't have the chance to leave the north. As for staying and fighting to the death, who would want to die if they could live? Besides, it was meaningless, wasn't it? Do you have any other opinions? No? Then hurry up and leave. By the way, when I used my big move just now, the little guy kicked me unhappily. This is called fetal movement. Hey, you won't understand even if I tell you. When you go back, please inform the headquarters. When I go there, prepare some necessary things for a pregnant woman and find a professional to accompany her. Well, that's all for now. Thank you. Chapter 1069. After a thrilling moment, it finally returned to silence. Since it was over, it was time to calculate the gains and losses. The Gray Coat Army was more scared than hurt. There were basically no casualties, and Josiah and Fry were spared from the misfortune of being commanders without an army. If one ignored the ups and downs of the process, this ending was not bad. After all, the Gray Coat Army had achieved their goal in the end. They had obtained the war reparations and abundant supplies that the victors deserved. Their previous efforts had not been in vain. The Temple of Light had both gains and losses. They had not succeeded in scheming against the Gray Coat Army, and had even lost a few red-cloaked archbishops. This was a loss. However, the subsequent arrangements in the capital's palace were still considered smooth. Their collaborator, the first prince, had successfully removed the obstacles and ascended to the throne was just around the corner. They had also gotten rid of the Temple of Light's greatest enemy, the sword god's right-hand man and his eldest disciple, Haida. This was a gain. As for whether the gains outweighed the losses or the losses outweighed the gains, only the person who drank the water would know whether it was hot or cold, no matter how one looked at it. The one who had suffered the most was the second prince, who had come to the north to negotiate. Not only had he been schemed against by his own brother and the Empire's greatest power, the Temple of Light, but he had almost been annihilated. The forces that had remained in the capital's palace and stood on his side were now being cleansed and attacked by the first prince's side. It could be said that it was tragic. However, there was also something to be happy about. At least his life was saved, and there was still some hope left. When he returned to the south and gathered his former subordinates, he would still have a chance of winning, of course. These were all future matters, and there was no need to talk about them now, in the afternoon, at the Gray Coat Army's encampment. The Temple of Light has betrayed us? The fallen emissary Meredith? He even missed with his sword. It's so lively. What a pity. What a pity. If I had known, I would have gone with you to take a look, Sai. After hearing the general situation of the town, Lan Sha could not help but rub his hands in pity and sigh, looking very regretful. It was still the usual four-man group meeting, but Fry had gone to settle the frightened high-ranking generals and was not here. Therefore, Lan Sha's words of regret were, of course, meant for Tang In and Josiah. The two of them looked at each other, speechless at Lan Sha's gloating expression. Tang In rolled his eyes in annoyance. You call this a pity? This is called F***King Scary. Okay. Looks like I've underestimated the moral integrity of the Temple of Gods. After pausing for a moment, Tang In suddenly thought of the little nun who was as white as a sheet of paper in the cathedral by the sea. Then he thought of the archcardinal's cunning and hypocritical face and shook his head. He was momentarily at a loss as to how he should evaluate the church. It's a pity that they ran fast. By the time I found out the location and chased after them, I still wasn't able to wipe out the so-called elite mages of the church. It's not your fault. They came prepared. Josiah was also a little scared. He sighed speechlessly. Moreover, before the negotiations began, the Temple of Gods was so enthusiastic about pulling strings. Who would have thought that they would have such a plan? Haha, you can only blame yourselves for not being careful enough. Our tribe has dealt with the Temple of Gods for so many years. We're already used to their hypocritical methods. Lan Sha chuckled and waved her hand. She was unusually calm as she added insult to injury. Then, she suddenly raised her eyebrows as if she remembered something. Oh, right, you said that the Bran Empire seems to be having an internal conflict. It's not seems, it's definitely. Tang In shook his head and smacked his lips. When the second prince returns to the south, the internal conflict will probably be even worse. However, TSK, I really don't want him to succeed. This second prince is not simple. He's quite daring. Under such circumstances, the first thing he thought of was to continue the negotiations. It's not surprising. This is the choice that any smart person would make. Lan Sha pushed up the frame of his glasses. He raised the corner of his mouth and said calmly, otherwise, not to mention returning to the south, it would be a problem if he could even get out of the town alive. Tang In and Josiah were silent. This was indeed the case. The confrontation between the two forces was very cruel. It was not mixed with personal emotions at all. Under such circumstances, if the second prince did not make such a choice, they really did not mind killing or capturing him alive. Even if the second prince's gentle attitude gave them a good first impression, after a short silence, Lan Sha covered the teacup on the table, clapped his hands, and suddenly stood up. Okay, I have to go. Twain was stunned when he heard that. Leave? Go where? The Northern Wilderness Army is here? So fast. He instantly reacted and turned to look at Josiah. The latter did not look surprised. Obviously, he knew the details better than Tang In, who had left for Mapletown a week ago. Yes. Lan Sha nodded lightly, confirming Tang In's guess. He then said with a smile, but it's not just because of this reason. Guess again. Tang and was slightly stunned. He pondered for a moment and then understood. He shook his head and laughed. I understand. So you're in a hurry to take advantage of the situation. What do you mean by taking advantage of the situation? This is called taking advantage of the situation. Lan Sha looked at him with dissatisfaction and said rather confidently, the brand's royal power in fighting is such a good opportunity. If I can't seize it, then I'm not worthy of being the tribe's commander. Huh? Wasn't that the reason? Tang and also stood up with a smile. Okay. Then I wish you success in this battle and successfully take down the brand. Oh, you really think so? Lan Sha raised his thin eyebrows and asked with a faint smile. Don't worry about these details. Okay, if Tang Yin really thought so, then he was a complete idiot. The reason was very simple. The brand, the Northern Wilderness, and the Grey Coat Army were the three main forces on the Caesar continent. Among them, the Grey Coat Army was the weakest. As the saying went, how could they allow others to sleep beside their bed? Whether it was the Bran Empire or the Northern Wilderness tribes, no matter which side had the absolute upper hand, it would be an extremely unfavorable situation for the newly established Grey Coat Army. Only when the three sides were in a stalemate and cooperated with each other. This was the basis of harmony. Of course, these inside stories could be understood tacitly. It would be bad to talk about it in public. After all, Lan Sha's identity was the tribe's royal highness and the future Northern Wilderness Empress. So, no matter how good her relationship with the Grey Coat Army or someone else was, it was impossible for her to go easy and give up the idea of attacking the Bran Empire. This was absolutely unrealistic. Josiah and the others were very clear about this point, but they were not too worried. A rotten ship still had 3 caddies of nails, not to mention the Bran Empire that had stood on the continent for thousands of years. So, the battle between the Northern Wilderness and the Bran was still going to be fought. It would be impossible to determine the winner in a short period of time. And this was also an opportunity for the Grey Coat Army to take advantage of. What they lacked now was time. As long as there was enough time to settle down, even if the Northern Wilderness tribes really destroyed the Bran, the Grey Coat Army would have the confidence to challenge them. At most, it would just be another battle when the time came. It was no big deal, of course. That was also a matter for the future. It was hard to say whether it would happen or not. It was meaningless to talk about it now. The current situation was that Tang Yin and the entire Grey Coat Army had to thank Lan Sha for his great help during this period of time. If Lan Sha had not commanded the army on behalf of the Grey Coat Army and fought in all directions, it would be impossible for the Grey Coat Army to have the great situation of almost completely controlling the entire Northern Bran. As if also aware of this, Josiah sat quietly at the side with his eyes slightly lowered and sipped his tea. It was rare that he did not disturb Lan Sha and Tang Yin's greetings and farewells. Of course, it could also be because in the past week, she and Lan Sha had already said what they should and should not say in private. Naturally, there was nothing more to say now, while in fact Tang Yin and Lan Sha did not talk for long. After all, no matter how much they exchanged pleasantries, there would be an end to it. Moreover, although Josiah did not interrupt, he did not leave either. However, just as Lan Sha smiled and nodded at Tang Yin for the last time, there was a hint of bitterness that was unknown to outsiders. He turned around and walked towards the door. With a creak, the door opened by itself. It was pushed open from the outside. Leader, Deputy Marshal Lan Sha. The one who spoke was Josiah's personal bodyguard captain, Victor. As soon as he came in, he looked up and saw Lan Sha standing in front of him. He could not help but be stunned. He bowed subconsciously and continued to report. Leader, there is a group of people outside who want to see you. They say they are from the New Stream. The leader is Owens. New Stream? Owens? Josiah was stunned. His expression was blank. Obviously, he was not familiar with these two names. Tang Yin, who was standing at the side, heard the news. He blinked and looked thoughtful. He nodded slightly to Victor, asked him to come in. Yes, they are acquaintances. They used to be from the Temple of Light. They tried to kill me. Tang Yin turned around and explained briefly to Josiah, who looked at him in surprise. Then, he ignored the strange expressions of Josiah and Lan Shah. He shrugged and said, "But it's okay now. They have already left the Temple of Light and set up another mountain to establish the new stream. Now, they specialize in fighting against the Temple of Light." After a pause, he said, "Well, they are somewhat acquainted with me." Josiah nodded in realization. "Listening to what you said, the new stream. I seem to have heard this name a few times recently. Well, but why did they come to the Gray Coat Army?" Maybe the enemy of my enemy is my friend." After Victor's interruption, Lan Shah did not leave immediately. He chuckled and made a guess. "Probably not." Shaking his head lightly, Tang stroked his chin and muttered, "Do you still remember how I forced out the location of the elite sorcerers of the Temple of Light that was hiding in the dark and ambushing them from those scammers? It was a cave. Although I was late and could not catch those guys, it was not like I did not get anything." Pause for a while. Judging from a messy condition of the rubble in the cave and the bloodstains that have not been cleaned up, there was a fierce battle not long ago. You mean, well, it was Owens and the others who were fighting against the elite mage group of the Temple of Light? Following Tang's train of thought, Josiah, who quickly reacted, could not help but ask in surprise, and it was because of their interference that Meredith's sword missed its target? It's just a guess. Although he said that, Tang was already 80 to 90% sure of it, because he knew that the new stream's current range of activity was on the eastern coastline thousands of miles away. So, the fact that Owens and the others were here now had already explained something. However, you guessed wrong. It was not us who saved you. Chapter 1070. You're wrong. We're not the ones who saved you. Then, the door was pushed open again. A figure holding a gun followed behind Victor into the room. Who else could it be other than Owens, who was covered in dust and fatigue? He stood still and scanned the room. He glanced at Lan Shah and fixed his eyes on Tang Yin. Then, he bowed slightly to Josiah, who stood up from behind the table. "I'm Owens from a new stream. Nice to meet you, Leader Josiah." Josiah returned the greeting and smiled. "You're too kind, Mr. Owens. Since you know Tang Yin, you're a friend of the Gray Coat Army. Please have a seat and have some tea." Owens was still polite. He gestured to Victor, who was walking towards the door. "It's my pleasure. There are more than 10 of my brothers outside. They're seriously injured. Thank you for sending them to the hospital in time." "Owens would like to thank you." Josiah looked at Victor in surprise. Victor nodded and explained, "Most of them are external injuries. They've been sent to the casualty barracks to be bandaged." "Okay." After a short pause, Josiah suddenly thought of something. He looked at Owens hesitantly and guessed, "Their injuries are because of us?" Owens nodded and then shook his head slowly. "That's right, but I'm not the one who led them here. It's Sylvia, right?" Tang Yin frowned and walked closer. It was not hard to guess. Since he was sure that the rescuer was from the new stream, it was no longer a problem for Tang Yin. The Flower of Nights, Sylvia? Needless to say, Sylvia was quite famous. Whether it was Josiah or Lan Shah, who was from a northern wilderness, they had all heard of it. The latter looked at Tang Un with a strange expression. When she first met Tang in the northern wilderness, Tang In was chased by Sylvia for thousands of miles. With such a relationship, why would Sylvia come to save him? Owens glanced at Tang In and smiled. He seemed to be quite satisfied with the latter's reaction, but he didn't answer directly. Instead, he sighed. "The new stream has already received the news that the Divine Hall wants to use this negotiation to plot against you. But, well, Xiao Weian had kept this information from the public. Perhaps she was worried that everyone would disagree, so she didn't discuss it with them. She casually made up a reason and led more than 10 riders over from thousands of miles away. Oh, this idiot. When I realized it and chased after her, it was already too late." After a pause, Owens looked at Tang In and Josiah, who were in a daze. He smiled bitterly and shook his head. "When Meredith, the emissary of the fallen, appeared, I was already nearby, but I was still one step too late. But, well, since you are all safe and sound, it means that she did succeed, right? The sword missed its target. So, it was really Her Excellency Sylvia who saved us. Josiah, who finally figured out who the savior of the Gray Coat Army was very excited. He subconsciously looked out of the door and asked eagerly, "Where is Her Excellency Sylvia now?" Such a big favor. Of course, she should be treated with courtesy and gratitude by the Gray Coat Army. Tang couldn't stay calm. He had guessed it, but when it was confirmed, he still felt different. He knew where the new stream's territory was now, and he knew that Owens was not exaggerating when he said thousands of miles away. The actual distance was more than thousands of miles. Where is she? Injured? Recalling that Owens had said that more than 10 of his brothers were seriously injured, Tang Un's face changed, and he asked hurriedly, "I don't know if she is injured or not." Owens was expressionless. "I only know that she was captured by the temple." What? Impossible. Not to mention Josiah's shock. Tang shook his head subconsciously and denied it without thinking. His eagle-like eyes stared at Owens, and he frowned. "I know Sylvia's character very well, and you know even better. How could you be captured? Impossible. If it was before, of course I knew it was impossible. But now it is the truth." Owens didn't look away. He also stared at Tang and Josiah and said solemnly, "Before she was captured, she asked the injured brothers to pass a message to me. She also asked me to tell you that this time she saved you, and now it's your turn to save her." Tang stared at Owens's expression for a while, and it didn't seem to be fake. He took a deep breath and said seriously, "Where will she be imprisoned?" "The temple headquarters. Based on her level and the hatred of the temple, she can only wait for her trial in the temple headquarters." "No problem. Your Excellency Owens, please rest assured that the Gray Coat Army will do our best to save Sylvia." Josiah, who came back to his senses, expressed his position without hesitation. Owens shook his head gently, and there was no joy on his face. "It's not enough. It's far from enough." "What's not enough?" "There's not enough time to rescue her. She is now in the temple headquarters, and her life is in danger. Even if you rush to rescue her now, the time spent on the road is enough to determine her life and death." "That's not necessary." Lan Shah, who was standing on the side, frowned and said, "With Sylvia's prestige and brand, no matter how much the temple hates her, they should consider the thoughts of the believers. At least they should go through some trial procedures and so on, right?" Owen still shook his head. "Maybe, but this is not enough to be safe." "Then what do you mean?" After a pause, Owens didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked at Lan Shah and Josiah, and suddenly said to Tang In, "Although the new church has been established for a short time, our intelligence is not weak. If I remember correctly, Leader Josiah and you are lovers, right? And this is Miss Lan Shah, also known as Her Highness in the Northern Wilderness. She has a good relationship with you, right?" Tang Un and the other two were stunned. They were not shocked by the intelligence ability of the new church mentioned by Owens. After all, from the fact that the other party knew about the temple's plan earlier, it was clear that the intelligence ability of the new church should be in the same vein as the temple. Both were extraordinary. They were just surprised by what Owens said, which seemed to have no obvious connection with the current situation. Tang In frowned. "Just say it." Owens nodded. "Well, I think you know the relationship between the temple and the Bran Empire. We are bound together for good or ill. So if you want to ensure Sylvia's safety, you can not only start from the temple, but also from the Bran Empire. To put it simply, you can increase the value of Sylvia as a captive, so that the temple headquarters will be afraid and will not act immediately." Pause for a while. Owens suddenly stood up and bowed 90 degrees to Josiah and Lan Shah, who were caught off guard. "Leader Josiah, Your Highness Lan Shah, I have thought about it. As long as the Gray Coat Army does not retaliate against the temple before the rescue operation is successful, and the Northern Wilderness tribes will stop attacking the Bran Empire, Sylvia will be safe in the temple headquarters. Please, Mr. Owens, what are you doing?" Josiah saw this and quickly stepped forward to help Owens up. Although the latter got up, he still looked at Josiah and Lan Shah with sincerity. It had to be said that Owens's idea was indeed good. If it was really as he said, then even if the temple was unwilling, The Crown Prince's empire would not sit back and watch Sylvia get into trouble. However, you are joking. Lansha did not hesitate to refuse coldly. Not to mention that I am not familiar with Sylvia. She did not save my life. Even if she did, do you think I would give up such a good opportunity to attack the Bran Empire? Although his words were not polite, the logic was right. Josiah did not care. After reaching an agreement with the second prince, the Grey Coat army did not immediately plan to take revenge and regain their face. But the Northern Wilderness tribes, represented by Lansha, were different. They and the Bran Empire were two huge forces with 1,000 years of enmity. It could not be changed by the will of any individual. And then again, even if Lansha wanted to help, he might not be able to make the decision. It was better to refuse directly, lest the other party had other thoughts. If that happened, it would be difficult to deal with. Tang and Josiah were naturally clear about this, and they were in no position to persuade him. Otherwise, they would fall out with Lansha. Therefore, they could not help but frown silently. The scene was silent because of this. At this time, haha, I knew it would be like this. If that's the case, Owens did not seem to be surprised by this result. He shook his head and muttered in a low voice. Then, he took a deep breath, straightened his chest, and looked directly at Tang Yin with bright eyes. Then I can only leave it to you. Sylvia is pregnant, your child. Am I my... What? At this moment, Tang Yin seemed to have been hit directly in the head by rolling heavenly thunder. His thoughts were frozen, and he was stunned. He was so dizzy that he did not know where he was. Sir Owens, you, Josiah and Lansha, who were equally shocked and speechless, regained their senses with great difficulty. They did not know whether to laugh or cry, and their faces were full of absurdity. This matter can be discussed. You don't have to, Lansha shook his head and laughed. No wonder you want to talk about my relationship with Tang Yin. Sir Owens, you can't be so naive, right? Do you think that by throwing out such an absurd reason, I will give up on attacking the Bran? Obviously, neither Josiah nor Lansha believed that Owens threw out this trump card. This was not strange. It would be strange if they believed it immediately. However, the strange thing was that Owens' expression did not change as well, as if he did not hear the doubts and questions. His gaze was still fixed on Tang Yin, and he slowly said, "You just said that Sylvia could not be captured." Yes, if it was Sylvia in her normal state, of course, it would be impossible for her to be captured. She would only fight to the death. However, if she is pregnant, think about it. With your understanding of Sylvia's personality, think about it again. Other than this, what other reason would she make such a choice? After he finished speaking, Tang Yin, who relied on his killer's strong instincts and barely recovered some of his consciousness, subconsciously thought about it. Then, the dam in his mind collapsed. There was only one thought in his mind that kept dancing and circling. Sylvia is pregnant? Sylvia is really pregnant. I have a child? I actually have a child. Fear, joy, disbelief. As a person of two lives, there were many complex emotions that he had never felt before. They mixed and spread. On the outside, he just stood there in a daze and was in a trance. Tang Yin was silent. Josiah and Lansha, who were observing him, were also silent. He was startled, and the expression of disbelief slowly faded from his face. It was replaced by a paleness that made one's heart palpitate. It was a pale, bloodless paleness. One of them fell back on the chair in a daze. Her fingers were intertwined, and her delicate body was curled up. The other one held her forehead and staggered back as if she could not bear the blow. Finally, when she was close to the wall, she was supported by Bamitu, who appeared out of thin air. There was a dead silence in the room. No matter how intense the emotional fluctuations were, there was not a single ripple. It was quiet and silent. He did not know how much time had passed. At least, Tang Yin, who was standing there in a daze, did not know. His thoughts had already drifted thousands of miles away, and his eyes were unfocused. He seemed to have heard a laugh. At the corner of the wall, a figure pushed away the supporting figure beside him, turned around, and walked towards the door. His back was resolute. He lifted his leg, kicked the wooden door open with a bang, and left. Not long after, a figure walked in front of him and seemed to be staring at him for a few minutes. Sean did not say anything. There was a broken glass in his eyes. He subconsciously reached out to grab the figure, but his arms seemed to be frozen and did not listen to his command. In the end, he could not reach out. Then he watched the figure slowly lower his head, turn around, and leave in a hurry. After a while, "I'm sorry." Owen stepped in front of Tang-un. He did not dare to look into his eyes. He subconsciously avoided his gaze and said with his head tilted. Sylvia had said before that she would not fight for anything. Therefore, the words she asked the new church knight to pass to Owens were for him to speak to Tang and alone. However, Owens did not do so. After he found the Gray Coat Army's encampment, he requested to meet Josiah. Because of this, the current situation was within his expectations. Owens did not regret his choice. Even if he had to do it all over again, he would still do it. The reason was very simple. This way, he could better ensure Sylvia's safety in the temple headquarters. However, it was a little cruel to Tang and Josiah, and perhaps to Lansha, of course. No matter what the reason was, he was still the one who spoke out of turn. Therefore, Owens apologized. After a while, "No need. It's not your fault. It's my own fault." Owens was stunned. However, not long after, Tang-un's voice was frighteningly hoarse, like the cold wind blowing from the cracks in the Gobi Desert. It was obscure and indescribable. Ahem. If it wasn't for those things that happened between Sylvia and me in the small hotel, it would be useless for you to say these things. Isn't it? I just feel a little unprepared. Josiah didn't, but she did. Haha, this kind of thing really isn't up to anyone. Listening to Tang-un's calm self-analysis with an expressionless face, Owens could not help but take a step back subconsciously. He muttered to himself, unable to speak. It was only between noon and afternoon. Owens's decision was still a little hasty and hot-headed. Of course, he had also considered Tang-un's various reactions, including being silenced by a furious Tang and being unable to walk out of the Gray Coat Army's encampment, and so on. However, no matter what he imagined, it did not include Tang-un's current strange state. Calm, so calm that it was terrifying. Like a machine, he considered the problem methodically and dealt with the trouble. Tang-un, who did not feel that he was even more terrifying in Owens's eyes, paused for a while, took a deep breath, and returned to his original voice. He muttered to himself, "Let me think. According to the time, she should be about 8 months pregnant now. If this didn't happen, she would have been planning to hide it from me like this. She didn't even tell me when she was born? Ha! She really doesn't fight for anything. 8 months, the fetus should be formed. She dared to run around at such a sensitive time. She really has guts. By the way, how is her physical condition now?" She's pretty good." Owens subconsciously continued. "Except for this long journey, she usually pays attention to protecting herself. She basically doesn't go out. She also hired a few experienced women to accompany her. I only remember that other than vomiting a few times, there was nothing wrong with her body." "Oh, that's good. Haha. Otherwise, why would she be called a genius warrior? Her physical fitness is much stronger than ordinary women." "Yeah, huh?" Owens, who was not sure if this was humor or something else, could only laugh along foolishly. "Well, that's it for now." Tang-un rubbed his cheeks vigorously as if he was washing his face. He seemed to have completely recovered and nodded politely to Owens. "You are more familiar with the temple headquarters than I am. Tonight, no. Tomorrow morning, you'll go to the south with me. Is there a problem?" "No problem." "Well, what should you prepare? You can go to Victor, the person who brought you into the station just now. Just tell him." He raised his hand and walked out of the door. When he stepped over the threshold, he paused and turned his head. "By the way, has she named the child in advance?" "Yes, there's several, but she hasn't confirmed it yet. Some time ago, she was discussing it with her new friend, Cindy." "Cindy? She don't let her name it." Chapter 1071. Walking out of the door, he raised his head and subconsciously narrowed his eyes. Tang-un had never felt that this dim light could be so dazzling. It was as if the light had illuminated his entire body from top to bottom, leaving no room for escape. Even the thoughts of shame and guilt had nowhere to hide. Unconsciously, he wanted to avoid it. He followed the shadows of the corners of the walls and turned whenever he saw a path. He walked in a muddle-headed manner. Along the way, he seemed to have met David and told him something, but it was forgotten in the blink of an eye. In the past, his mind was clear, calm, and ruthless. Now, it was like an overloaded machine, groaning and whining until it went out of control. He was like a wild horse that had broken free of its reins. Sometimes, he would think of Josiah's extremely sorrowful eyes. Sometimes, he would think of Sylvia's enchanting figure in the small hotel. Sometimes, he would think of his child, who had yet to be officially named. Sometimes, he would feel that his surroundings were a little cold, and the cold wind was bone-chilling. Finally, he had a splitting headache. After walking for an unknown period of time, perhaps it would only be a moment, or perhaps it would be another 2 hours. Raising his hand, he massaged the sides of his head with great force. Raising his head, he saw an extremely familiar wooden door in front of him. He was startled. This was Josiah's room in the temporary encampment, which was also Tang En's room. Of course, that might not be the case anymore. However, the power of habit was really strong. After going around in circles unconsciously, it still brought him here in the end. The door was closed, but not locked. It was still a subconscious action. Tang En stretched out his hand and gently pushed the door. With a creak, light slipped in through the gap between the door and instantly brought a small patch of light to the dark room. It illuminated the familiar figure sitting alone at the table in a daze with dim and slightly red eyes, as if he was a frozen statue. After a long period of silence, Sylvia didn't raise her head. She just stared blankly at the simple wooden table. Then, he opened his mouth, his voice low and hoarse. After the battle in Dawn City, I said that I would avenge Auntie Rosa. I won't let any traitors off. When we were hunting down the Borg family, you told me that Michaud was dead. You killed him with your own hands. Half a year ago, you brought people to the south to save my family. The person who escorted my father and mother back was wearing a silver mask. Was that Michaud? A few months ago, Lan Sha came to the Grey Coat Army. You said that she's a member of the royal family, so she might have a good impression of you. But it doesn't matter, it's just a little bit. I do have a good impression of her. She came to me and said that she could help the Grey Coat Army deal with the brand and help us take over the entire Northern Territory. Your request is for me to leave you. Sylvia, I've heard you talk about her before, but you don't talk about her often. She's the one you don't talk about often, but she's the one who's closest to you. She's pregnant with your... She paused for a moment, then lowered her face even more to avoid the light, and buried her face in her golden brown hair. He muttered in a low voice, I don't want to bring up old scores. In the past, when I was in Lion City, I didn't like banquets because I didn't like to listen to those noble women harping on old scores and scolding those who betrayed me. Wasn't that their choice back then? Since he had already made his choice, he would have to bear the consequences, right? I didn't expect that one day I would become the kind of person that I hated the most back then. But what else do you want me to do? Do I agree to let you save Sylvia? Go. I agree. I'm sincere. Without stepping into the house, Tang En left in a daze again. This time, he didn't go far. He sat on the roof in a daze. During this time, he didn't say a word. What else could he say? Was he sorry? Did he have a right to say that? In the end, it was just retribution where there was cause and effect, and only when there was effect would there be cause. He brought it upon himself, so he couldn't blame anyone else. After a while, David leaped onto the roof and walked over. The blue tiles under his feet creaked, but he couldn't make Tang En, whose facial features were extremely sharp, move at all. Boss, we couldn't catch up. Miss Lan Sha is no longer within the range of the encampment. She should have left with Bamitu and returned to the tribal army. Under the premise that Sylvia had to be saved, Owens's 2 suggestions were very reliable. There was no need to talk about the Grey Coat Army. They didn't have any immediate plans to take revenge. As for Josiah himself, although he was filled with hatred now, he couldn't do anything to not help his benefactor and instead harm her. The most likely possibility was that he would ignore it. In this way, the problem was focused on Lan Sha. Unfortunately, the latter was probably heartbroken and had left without saying goodbye, not giving them any chance to discuss it. There was no response. Tang Un was frozen in his sitting position as he looked at the setting sun in the west. He was silent like a statue. After waiting for a moment, David sighed inwardly and left quietly. When he landed on the ground, Harry, Luke, and the other members of the gray space immediately surrounded him and asked anxiously, "How is it?" David sighed and shook his head. "Sigh, I knew it would be like this. This kind of thing can't be hidden forever. Why don't we help persuade him?" "David, didn't you meet Leader Josiah the earliest and have a good relationship? Why don't you give it a try?" "I want to try, but how do you think I should persuade someone who knows? Also, Josiah is so smart. He must have guessed that we knew about this long ago, but didn't tell him." "That's true. Then what should we do now?" "What do you mean, what should we do? I think we should just do our own thing. Outsiders can't help with this kind of thing. It'll only make things worse." "That makes sense. Let the boss handle it himself. If the boss can't do it, then there's no point in us being anxious." After a pause, David suddenly reacted and looked at Harry in surprise. "Yeah, you seem to be quite experienced." Hearing this, Harry immediately became smug. "Ha, of course. Don't you know who I am? Then why don't you analyze it?" "What's there to analyze? The boss is definitely in the wrong." Harry didn't hesitate and said eloquently, "I saw that something was wrong before. Other than Sylvia, do you still remember that Lena? She's obviously interested in the boss too. Unfortunately, the boss can't see clearly because he's involved. He's usually so smart, but he couldn't see it. TSK, TSK. That's why I said this kind of thing would happen sooner or later. Sigh. It's all because Leader Josiah has no experience. He's focused on developing the Gray Coat Army and neglected the boss. He didn't watch over the boss, which led to a big mistake." Cough, cough. Harry, don't interrupt. Let me finish. Well, to be honest, the boss's appearance is a little ordinary. It's completely not the word handsome. But he couldn't stop Boss from being so strong and skilled in saber techniques. He's also quite humorous and has a good personality. Of course, girls won't have any thoughts when they first meet this type of man. But after a period of contact, it's over. To be very responsible, it's over. He just like me. After saying a lot, he patted his chest. Harry's expression was one of exultation. Because of that, he didn't notice the glances that David and the others were giving him. "Anything else?" "Of course there is. Believe it or not, I have evidence. Sylvia and Lan Sha are living examples. Look at their relationship with the boss. Sylvia used to be enemies with the boss. As long as they met, they would fight. They couldn't wait to stab each other to death. Not to mention Lan Sha. The boss is from the brand. She's from the Northern Wilderness. She's even the princess of the Northern Wilderness. Just this point, tell me, other than the boss's inner charm, what else could attract her to shamelessly give birth to the boss's child?" Cough, cough. Harry, don't talk nonsense. The one who gave birth to the boss's child is Sylvia, not Miss Lan Sha. Harry paused and then waved his hand carelessly. It's the same. It's the same. It's just a matter of time. And so, Josiah should choose to leave and let them be? What a waste. No matter what, Josiah is the real deal. What kind of woman would let go of her man and watch helplessly as the bastard, cough, cough, helplessly watch as another woman surpasses her and snatches her man? Harry looked righteous and then changed the topic. However, it's useless for us to talk about this. We have to see what Josiah thinks. After all, it's already happened. The child is about to be born. Under such circumstances, the possibility of the boss choosing to let go is very slim. Don't talk about the boss. Let's let you choose. David, you... Hey, what's wrong with your eyes? David touched his forehead and couldn't bear to look at him. He sighed. I'm blind, His fat body suddenly stiffened. No matter how long his reflexes were, he should have reacted by now. Moreover, Harry had always been smart. He looked as if his parents had died. He moved his neck and looked like he wanted to turn but didn't dare to. It was hard for him to be so smart. He laughed dryly and wanted to make up for it. Actually, this is mainly Xia Anwei's fault. No, it's Sylvia. No, it's this B asterisk TCH who has bad intentions and seduced the boss. Enough. David waved his hand and interrupted. The corner of his mouth twitched. He's already gone. Why are you still pretending? Gone? Harry turned around and saw an extremely familiar figure walk into the room behind him and close the door with a bang. Who else could it be but Josiah? TSK. Look at what you're capable of. How is it? You got your retribution, didn't you? I didn't know. It's over. Harry wiped the sweat off his forehead with a long face. Do you think Josiah will make things difficult for me in the future? You deserve it. You're asking for it. David's face was full of anger, and he turned to leave after he finished speaking. Sigh, look at my stupid mouth. Harry slapped his fat face and chased after them. Brothers, you have to save me. Save you? Hurry up and stay away from us. Go. You guys have a part to play too. You can't leave us in the lurch. Who are you? We don't know you. When they were close to the corner of the wall, Harry, who was one step behind, suddenly paused his steps. He turned his head and looked at Xiao Sei, who was still sitting on the roof motionlessly. He sighed and murmured to himself, Come on, boss. Harry, this is all I can do for you. Chapter 1072. The next day, the morning light shone and the night mist drifted. Tang In remained in the exact same position, sitting on the green tiles of the roof for the whole night, welcoming the first ray of light in the morning. His exposed clothes were already soaked and clung to his body, bringing with them the bone-piercing cold of the night. Even his eyebrows, eyelashes, and sideburns were stained with a thin layer of frost. From afar, he looked like an ancient bronze statue, full of coldness and vicissitudes. Only his eyes, which had not closed for the whole night, were no longer in a trance. Perhaps it was because he had enough time to reflect and adjust. Tang In's eyes had basically returned to calmness. At least on the surface, it was as quiet as ice water. As for whether there was anything hidden under the ice water, it was unknown. At this moment, an opened wine jar with a faint wine fragrance appeared in front of Tang In out of thin air. I guess you need this right now. Since Tang In had regained his calmness, with his keen perception, the only person who could appear out of thin air around him could only be Bamitu, who had left and returned. Shaking his head slightly, Tang In opened his mouth and spoke for the first time since he sat here. His voice was hoarse. We still have to hurry. It's just a jar of wine to moisten your throat. It won't cause any problems. After a pause, Tang In raised his hand and took the jar of wine. Thank you. There's no need. Bamitu simply waved his hand and sighed as he sat by Twain's side. If it weren't for the fact that my injuries haven't healed and my strength has been greatly reduced, causing me to be inferior to you, I would surely give you a good beating first. The corner of Tang In's mouth twitched, and he forced a smile. Then he raised his head and drank a mouthful of wine, returning to his normal voice. Elder Ba, you're too polite. If you really want to teach me a lesson, injuries and strength are not an obstacle. This was not modesty, it was the truth. As the saying goes, a thousand-legged worm dies, but never falls down. For a master like Bamitu, as long as he was still breathing, even if he was covered in wounds, who would dare to underestimate him? Bamitu smiled when he heard this. He didn't deny it, but he didn't agree either. He just changed the topic and shook his head with a sigh. Speaking of which, I still thought very highly of you before. I also thought that you and Lan Sha would end up together in the end. Otherwise, I wouldn't have agreed to accompany her to the Grey Coat Army. It's just that I didn't expect. You really didn't let me down. You're so generous when you make a move. You quietly made a child outside. The jug of wine paused in midair. Tang In replied indifferently. Elderba didn't come here just to make fun of me, right? Of course not. Bamitu clapped his hands, stood up, and said, I'm here to pass on a message. Of course, you can see it as a snitch. After all, although that person did not avoid my orders, he also did not ask me to pass them on. Well, the mountains are high and the road is long. Plus, the warriors are not used to the climate of Bran and so on. In order to be safe, The vanguard of the tribal army is estimated to take about a month to reach the front line of the battle, the Lino River. Tang Yin was stunned when he heard this. The jug of wine was touching his lips. After a while, he slowly put it down. Thank you. Thank her for me. The so-called high mountains and long road, and the reasons of not being used to the climate were, of course, just excuses. The barbarian soldiers could even ignore the harsh living environment of the northern wilderness. How could they not adapt to the good climate of the brand? Therefore, instead of saying that they had to spend about a month on the road, it was better to say that they had to make way for Tang Yin's next move. He waved his hand. I said there's no need. And this is just a strategic decision made for the sake of safety. It has nothing to do with other things. Well, since the message has been passed, I won't stay any longer. Bam Mudhu was very straightforward. A moment ago, he said he was going to leave, but the next moment, his figure had already disappeared into the void, leaving only a faint warning reminder. Be careful, kid. The Divine Palace headquarters is not a place you can easily break into. Although the old Pope's strength is terrible, he has a lot of tricks up his sleeves. Don't provoke him if you can. Of course, if you can send him to see the so-called God of Light, then I'll treat you to a drink when I come back. As soon as he finished speaking, he quickly disappeared along with a gradually dissipating faint mist. In the end, he disappeared completely. After a pause, Tang Yin slowly got up. Under the thin light from the east, he raised his head and drank the rest of the wine. Then he threw the empty jug far away and jumped off the roof. Boss! Before the jug that was still drawing a parabola in the air fell to the ground, a group of figures had quickly jumped out from all corners and gathered around Tang in an instant. In the gray space, everyone was present. David, stay with your people and protect the station. The rest of you, come with me. Owens, come with us. Little Carol, what are you doing here? Go accompany your sister Josiah. You're not allowed to go anywhere. David, watch over her. As their strength grew day by day and the team became more mature, the members of the gray space hadn't acted with Tang Yin for a long time. As a result, the people who were called out, such as Harry and Luke, were naturally overjoyed. On the other hand, little Carol, David, and David's team members, who had been left behind, were depressed when they heard this. However, the situation this time was special. Coupled with Tang Yin's biting cold, unapproachable aura, they knew that there was no room for negotiation. They could only pinch their noses and accept it. Time was of the essence, and the situation was critical. To be honest, the fact that Lan Sha had made a concession was already beyond Tang Yin's expectations. Thus, everything had to be simple and fast. After quickly giving the order and explaining everything succinctly, Tang Yin turned around and left without saying anything else. At that moment, David suddenly called out, Boss, should we say goodbye to Josiah first? Pausing, Tang Yin turned his head to look at the room behind him. The doors and windows were closed. He took a deep breath and strode away. Let's go. It was still the same thing. Saying anything now was useless. It might even cause the opposite effect and intensify the conflict. It was better to separate for the time being and calm down for a while. That might be better, but there was no guarantee. There was no farewell, nor was there a send-off. Not many people in the station knew about Sylvia. Apart from David and the other members of the Gray Space, there were only a few people involved. Even Fry and the other higher-ups didn't know. So, when Tang Yin quietly left the station with Owens and half of the Gray Space members in the light of dawn, no one woke up early to send them off. Outside, Harry and the others had already prepared fast horses. They didn't stop at all and rushed out of the station as fast as they could. Tang Yin, galloping, Owens urged his horse closer. Have you set the route? As far as I know, there's a long-range transmission tower in Sharon City, which is more than 100 kilometers away. If it wasn't destroyed in the war, we'll go after her first. Tang Yin interrupted. Go after her? Who? The second prince. Good idea. It was indeed a good idea. After the temple caught Sylvia, of course, they wouldn't try her immediately and execute her secretly. After all, Sylvia was a person of prestige. Even if she was now against the temple, there would always be some believers who were skeptical. The temple had to give a reasonable explanation. During this time, after the position of the Gray Coat Army and the tribal army spread to the south, the temple would naturally be more reluctant to kill Sylvia. Or even if they were willing to, the Empire would not agree. Of course, even if they didn't kill Sylvia, they would definitely put her under house arrest. At the same time, the Empire and the temple would definitely think of the coming rescue operation and would certainly make all kinds of arrangements. It was not an exaggeration to say that when Tang In and his rescue team officially set foot on the southern land, it would be the beginning of heavy blockades and encirclement. Tang In was confident in himself and the gray space. These blockades and encirclement should not be able to stop them. But it was inevitable that when they dealt with these blockades and encirclement, the rescue progress would inevitably be slowed down and unnecessary time would be wasted. This was what Tang In didn't want to see. So he had to disrupt the situation first and disrupt the joint deployment of the temple and the Empire. And the shit stirrer, who could have such a powerful effect, was naturally the second prince and his group. This was almost certain. When the Empire announced that the second prince, who had died in the hands of the Gray Coat Army, suddenly appeared in the southern land, it would definitely cause a huge commotion. And this was also the opportunity for Tang In and his group to fish in troubled waters. Of course, these were just expectations. The first problem that Tang In had to solve was to obtain the cooperation of the second prince and his group. And in fact, this was not difficult. Putting aside the night, it was just a short half-day. Even if the second prince and his noble negotiation team were eager to return home, no matter how fast they were, of course, it was impossible for them to fly out of the northern boundary immediately. In fact, Tang In and his group did not even need half a day to successfully intercept the other party on the mountain path. When he saw the second prince, Tang In did not hide anything. Now, he did not have the time or mood to hide anything. He directly explained the situation concisely and put forward his request, then waited for the other party's decision. The second prince was naturally shocked by Tang In's sudden arrival. After all, they were now in the territory of the Gray Coat Army. If the other party had the intention to kill them, there was really not much they could do. However, as expected of the smart person that Lan Shah had mentioned, after a simple understanding of the situation, the second prince did not hesitate and immediately nodded in agreement. No problem. Everything will go according to what His Excellency Tang In said. We will definitely cooperate. I do not agree. Of course, there was never a lack of people in this world who sang a different tune. Perhaps they felt that the second prince had agreed too readily, or perhaps they felt that they were the smart ones. Before the second prince finished speaking, an old noble with curly hair stood out. He stroked his white beard and said, "The negotiation agreement has just been reached. Logically speaking, we are now partners with the Gray Coat Army, so we should naturally help each other. But after all, this is not an official matter, but His Excellency Tang In's personal matter, so it is not within the scope of the negotiation agreement." After a pause, he suddenly changed the topic. Of course, it's not that we can't help with personal matters, but if you want to get something, you have to give first. After all, when we return to the South, our future is uncertain. After a meaningful sigh, the eyes of the surrounding members of the noble negotiation team lit up. They looked at Tang In and wanted to say something. As the saying went, one had to listen to what was being said. This was especially important when talking to people who boasted of their high status. For example, right now, although this curly-haired old noble was rambling on, the main point was only one sentence. If you want to get something, you have to give first. To put it bluntly, Tang In was now asking them for a favor. And since they were asking for a favor, of course, there had to be a reward. As for what the reward was, it was to take this opportunity to tie Tang In and the others to the noble negotiation team. This way, when they returned to the South, they would have an additional layer of personal protection. How to put it? According to the principle of equivalent exchange, this request was not too much. After all, There was no free lunch in this world. Since Tang and wanted to use them to stir up trouble, it was only natural for them to use them for self-defense, wasn't it? It was just a pity that this curly-haired old noble had forgotten what it meant to say that the situation was stronger than the person. He had also forgotten whose territory he was standing on now. More importantly, he had neglected Tang Un's current mood. If you want to get something, you have to give first. And that makes sense. Tang In rubbed his eyebrows, looked at the curly-haired old noble, and nodded with a smile. The old noble and the surrounding group of old nobles could not help but be delighted when they saw this. They only took it as Tang Un's agreement. Only the second prince's expression changed drastically when he heard this. He subconsciously stepped sideways and waved his hand, blocking in front of the curly-haired old noble. Wait! A gust of wind blew past him, and his outstretched hand suddenly heated up. With a flash of the blade, a column of blood shot up to the sky like an underground fountain. It splashed everywhere, instantly drenching the faces of the surrounding old nobles who were caught off guard. They stood there stupefied. The curly-haired old noble, who still had a triumphant smile at the corner of his mouth, had already left his body and was easily caught in Tang Un's hand. He turned his head sideways and glanced at the few royal consecrators who had just stepped forward and raised their hands. His gaze was as cold as ice. When the latter saw this, they looked at each other and smiled bitterly. They quietly put down their hands and retreated behind the second prince again. He retracted his gaze and lifted his foot to kick. The headless corpse flew into the ravine beside the road. Tang In half turned and held the curly-haired head. He looked at the stunned nobles with a calm expression. Now, who agrees? Who opposes? You're tuning in to the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.